Part 3 of Confronting the Artificial Stone Silicosis Epidemic, a Unified Approach to Medical, Litigation, and Regulatory Action. This section examines the legal, regulatory, and policy responses to this growing public health crisis, while also centering on the voices of the victims. Through personal accounts, we hear directly from workers and families affected by artificial stone silicosis, underscoring the human cost of this preventable disease. Let's begin with Part 3.
Okay, welcome back. So it's fitting that since we are in the American Museum of Tort Law, that we should talk about the litigation, some torts. And so again, my name is James Nevin from the law firm of Brayton, Purcell. And we have a majority of the cases filed throughout the country for artificial stone workers with silicosis. So far, we have cases filed in California, Washington, Oregon, Utah, Florida, and Kentucky. And so today we're going to talk about the litigation landscape. This is a shameless plug for my podcast, which talks about all these issues. This is the QR code if you'd like to get a link to the podcast, available on YouTube, Spotify, and our website. So, before we talk about the litigation, again, we got to think about the context of how we're here. And so we're here with silicosis being the oldest occupational disease known to man. Not new at all. Fast forward in time, we have the Hawk's Nest disaster in the 1930s in America, which triggers the first serious regulatory efforts to address silicosis in workers. Again, none of these are countertop fabrication workers, but silicosis in various other blue-collar trades, miners, sandblasters, tunnel builders, and so forth. Again, fast forward way in time, and we're at the point where silicosis in the U.S. is really down to almost nothing on a yearly basis. Now, silicosis is still a problem around the world, especially in particular third world countries, but it was pretty much eradicated in the U.S. And then artificial stone gets introduced, and the first epidemic, as you've heard today, is reported by Dr. Kramer in Israel, where Caesar stone started, going back to workers who were diagnosed starting in 1997, moving forward. Again, skipping ahead in time, now in the U.S., we have the first reported case in 2014, reported by Dr. Harrison and others, of a person in Texas. Again, skipping ahead, we have the Center for Disease Control issuing a bulletin of an outbreak of workers in California, Colorado, Texas, and Washington with artificial stone silicosis from 2017 to 2019. Boom, to 2024, we have Australia, as you've heard, dealing with the massive increase of workers in Australia, and Australia banning it. To then, we can look at Southern California as sort of the canary in the coal mine for the U.S. of this explosion of artificial stone silicosis, particularly because Southern California in particular, has a very high concentration of fabrication shops in the same area, many of them close to Jane Fazio at UCLA. And so, thank God, this population managed to get to an occupational medicine doctor that knew to start looking for it. Again, fast forward to today, the CDPH is now up to 538 cases of artificial stone silicosis. Why is that? Well, we see when we look around the world, there's a three-step process. The first process is artificial stone is introduced in that particular geography and begins to displace natural stone. And then at the point where it displaces natural stone, we see an epidemic of disease in the countertop fabrication workers. And then we see legal efforts. And so, for example, in Spain, we see extensive workers' compensation claims, and we see criminal prosecution of the Spanish company Cosentino, the manufacturer of artificial stone, as well as the CEO himself, were both criminally prosecuted in Spain for this. In the U.S., we deal with this differently. And it's important to know whether we're talking about a fabrication shop like this one, which is actually one of our next speakers, fabrication shop from Southern California, incredibly sophisticated, incredibly wet. Or you're looking at a dust storm of a shop, like we've seen on the news, certain so-called dry shops. We're seeing disease in all types of shops. And so the reason for that, as the doctors today touched on, is been established by hundreds of published peer-reviewed medical literature and scientific literature over the last decade. And the instant, easily recognizable reason is the high content of the crystalline silica in the artificial stone. Crystalline silica, a long-known toxin and carcinogen. That part is not new. And so you take something like natural stone, which traditionally is very low silica content, and now you're replacing with something with incredibly high silica content. But it's not just that. So when the artificial stone slabs are manufactured, they are manufactured with with the quartz, which is a natural stone, comes out of the ground, but it's intentionally pulverized into an ultrafine and nano-sized powder. That's what's going into the product when it's made at the manufacturing plants, mixed with the toxic metals and toxic resins. And so you get this 100% toxic soup of nano-sized material. You don't get that with natural stone. So even with certain natural stone, like say quartzite, which also has high content, it doesn't have these tiny particles of silica, and it doesn't have the metals and resins. And it's that combination that has led WEMA and pretty much every occupational doctor around the world who's looked at this to conclude that crystalline silica artificial stone is a uniquely toxic product that can't be fabricated safely by human beings unless they're wearing a level A hazmat suit. So that's sort of the basis of this litigation. And the Dr. Hoy just talked about the hierarchy controls and why those lower controls don't work, and that's a fundamental part of the litigation, is that the mass don't work, administrative controls don't work, engineering controls don't work, and so what's left is that the slab manufacturers, and so not the fabrication shops, but the manufacturers who are making this product need to substitute out or eliminate the product. Recycled glass, for example, is made from amorphous silica, and even though it has the name silica, amorphous silica is non-toxic. So you could be sucking down a whole bunch of dust from a recycled glass slab. It's a nuisance dust. You shouldn't breathe it. Not great, but it's not going to cause silicosis. And so, again, that's the underlying basis for the litigation. Another really important point, if we look at the CDPH data, they're tracking not just the number of workers, but the number of fabrication shops with at least one reported case of silicosis. And so they, at this point, have confirmed, vetted, that there's at least 715 fabrication shops with silicosis in California, and they've confirmed that there are 1,342 fabrication shops. In other words, it's a process where they have to vet both. Is this actually a fabrication shop? And does it have silicosis? And that's a long process for them. And I blew up the fine print on their website because it's important to note that they were up to, 550 cases of silicosis, but at this point they've only vetted 292 of those for their work histories. That tells us that there's a whole lot more fabrication shops that they haven't yet vetted. So this 715 number is going to keep going up in California. One of the reasons we know that is we do our own data analysis, and so at Brayton Purcell. And so, for example, at this point, we have vetted nationally. We've confirmed 5,000 fabrication shops. Are there more? Yes, but there's 5,000 that we've confirmed. This is actually a fabrication shop. It's not a supplier. It's not something else. It's a place that does countertop fabrication, and we have found thus far. Again, this is our data, but we have found so far that approximately 1,000 of those shops nationally have silicosis. So if you go with that, that's 1/5 of shops in the nation with silicosis. I think that number is likely low, but that's where we are on the vetting process, and that's already over the top. So we go back to the CDPH and their current number of 538 diagnosed patients with silicosis. Again, it's a slow vetting process. That's where they're at. We're actually a bit ahead of them. So There's approximately 3 or 4 other firms that do these cases, and collectively they probably have about 200 workers with silicosis. We at Brayton Purcell, we have so far 550 artificial stone fabrication workers with silicosis from California. 497 of those are in Southern California, again, tip of the iceberg, canary in the coal mine. But we already have 53 in Northern California. So we see the epidemic spreading even within California. More significantly, we have approximately 200 other artificial stone fabrication workers from 23 other states. They're catching up. Again, if you think, when did the product become popular in the US? Well, it became popular in California first. So as it's become more popular in other states, there's a lag, and they're starting to catch up. So compare that with the CDPH data. We also found that, as the doctors have mentioned, that there is a serious problem with the lack of access to medical care for a large majority of these workers, particularly because so many in every community are migrant workers, typically don't have health insurance. But even when there are workers that have health insurance, most doctors don't know to look for this. They don't know to do an occupational history. They don't know to do an HRCT scan. If a worker actually comes in sick, they're going to think it's tuberculosis or any other thing, as the doctors mentioned earlier. So we have undertaken our own process where when we encounter a worker, we first do a full occupational history to ensure, is this a fabrication worker? Have they been fabricating artificial stone for at least a few months, typically at least a few years, and some guys longer? We then send them for a high-resolution CT scan. The results are shocking, absurd. You heard Dr. Hoyt say that he was talking about one study that showed a 28% prevalence, and that was insane. And from a public health point of view, anything over a few percent is an epidemic. 28% is a catastrophe. I don't even know what to call our findings, because thus far we found 353 are positive and 77 are negative. That's an 82% prevalence rate. Take that and apply it to a shop. 82% of those workers are going to get silicosis. This is a national catastrophe. It's utterly insane that we are okay with this as a nation. That was our California rate of 82%. Our national rate is almost as high, 77%. So to the extent that the argument is, California, there's a whole bunch of unsophisticated shops, they all just need to be arrested. Well, let's look nationally, where there's less unsophisticated shops. There's more sophisticated shops. We're still so far finding a prevalence rate of 77%. Again, through the roof. We also starting to track data on the members of the ISFA, which is the International Surface Fabrication Association, and the Natural Stone Institute, which is ironically named because mostly they represent artificial stone manufacturers. And we only just started this. So this data is going to get more and more and more. But we are already we have tracked silicosis in 31 member shops of either ISFA or NSI. And these are the sophisticated shops. They're certified, they're trained, they're licensed. Everything that industry says you need, they have silicosis too. And again, this is just the start. I'm sure these numbers are going to keep growing. In terms of now, what has that led to? Well, it's led to litigation. So the other firms that I've mentioned have thus far filed approximately 150 cases, mostly in California. There are a few cases in Chicago, and there's a few cases in Texas that have been filed. And we have filed at Brayton Purcell 400 cases so far. 385 are in California, and 15 are outside of California, as I mentioned, in Washington, Oregon, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, Kentucky, and Florida. We have approximately 300 cases pending because it takes a while to vet the work histories and vet the medical records and do all the steps necessary to file a case. So these numbers are growing. The disease levels are also revealing. So of our filed cases, so just counting our filed cases, so not counting other firms, not counting cases not yet filed, if we look just at our filed cases, 36 are post-transplant, meaning they've had their transplant, their first lung transplant. Transplanted lungs only last about 5 years, so a few of these guys are getting close to the point where they will either need a second transplant or they will pass away. 14 are on the transplant list, waiting for donor lungs to become available. 3 were found that they needed a transplant, but they are ineligible due to comorbidities, and I talked to Dr. Fazio a little bit about that today. So for example, if you have an active tuberculosis infection, you can't get a lung transplant. If you are obese, you can't get a lung transplant, things like that. Setting aside the folks with on transplant, there's 123 that have complicated silicosis, meaning at some point in the next few years, they are going to get to the next step where they need a transplant. 127 have simple silicosis. We saw today from some of the doctors the shocking rate at how quickly they're finding simple silicosis turns into complicated silicosis, just a few years. So those simple silicoses, as we go on the next few years, are more and more of them are going to become complicated. And then we also have a very interesting finding of 78 lymph node silicosis. So lymph node silicosis has been referred to as the canary in the coal miner, because it is literally a marker in the worker that their lymph nodes have silicosis, and that continued exposure in that environment, they're going to then get pulmonary silicosis, starting with simple and then complex and so forth. So it's a very interesting cohort of data to look at. And then of course we have several that have lung cancer, rheumatoid arthritis, chronic kidney disease, or some combination of all these things. They'll have rheumatoid arthritis and silicosis, chronic kidney disease and silicosis. In terms of the litigation so far, again, just looking at our cases, there's 500 unique defendants. They're not all in each case, because we take a hard look at a worker's work history and look at what brands were they exposed to, who supplied them, and so forth. The average number of defendants in each case is 45, because a typical worker used a lot of brands supplied by a lot of sources, and as part of the litigation and looking at what is their total dose of exposure, we want to pull in all those entities, the manufacturers and the suppliers. We don't sue the fabrication shop employer owners when there are any. There's approximately 10 defendants that are pretty much in every case because everybody used them, Caesar Stone, Cambria, and others. And then so far, there are several defendants that have gone bankrupt. Mosaic, Walker Zanger, Compact USA, Lilly Industries, Best Year Stone, Hearst Class Corp., and they're all in various phases of the bankruptcy process. In terms of what these cases are about, as complex as the science that's been discussed today by the doctors is, what they're really saying when it comes to artificial stone is that artificial stone breathing leads to death, ABC. And that is the unfortunate reality of artificial stone because it is so uniquely toxic. Again, whether you're in a wet shop or a so-called dry shop that we used to see years ago, if you're breathing, that's the problem. And so these cases are typically about percentage of fault. It's not any one entity. It's not all Caesar Stone's fault. It's not all Cambria's fault. It's not all Arizona Tile's fault. It's not all the fault of the supplier or whoever. It's all of them. And the jury is tasked to decide what is the percentage of fault. And that's because we're looking at an exposure to a toxin and a carcinogen that a worker is breathing in over time, over months, years, decades. And it's the total dose of the artificial stone dust that they breathe in contributing to cause their silicosis or other disease. California and many other states have causation law that essentially is that did the insert defendant, their conduct or their product, contribute to the risk? Did it contribute to the exposure, therefore it contributed to the risk, therefore it contributed to the cause? So was it reasonably medically possible that the exposure was a contributing factor to the risk? And that's generally what the causation law is in these cases. We bring a lawsuit, we bring a tort alleging liability, and then there's other causes of action, but the main causes of action are negligence, which is conduct. What did they know? What did they not know? What did they do? What did they not do? The failure to conduct themselves reasonably to avoid injury to others. The classic nature of tort law in this country. We also bring product liability causes of action, and one of them is called design defect. Quite simply, that the product was not as safe as the worker expected, and product liability risk-benefit, which is the risk of the product outweigh the benefits. There's certainly some benefits of artificial stone over, say, natural stone, but compare those benefits really to the consumer. Do they outweigh the risks to the workers? Clearly not. And then whether it's under product liability or negligence, we also look at failure to warn. So most of these companies for a very long time weren't warning at all. And then when they did start warning, their warnings are entirely inadequate. A great example is even today in 2026, all the manufacturers and suppliers, their warnings essentially say, if you're doing this wet, you don't even need a mask. But if we look at the science from NIOSH and many others, they've done study after study after study showing that using wet methods, the levels are still not safe. Therefore, you need a mask, and you need a really good mask, and it needs to be fit tested, and you can't have a beard, and all these factors. Yet they're warning the workers essentially that just cut wet, everything's fine. These cases are seeking damages, economic damages to start with, loss of income. These are typically young workers who, once they get sick enough, can no longer work, can no longer support their families. So for decades of lost income. Medical expenses, the medical costs associated with silicosis are incredibly high. Typical lung transplant cost $1 million. And if you're lucky enough to get a second one, well, there's another $1 million. And then all the care in between the two. So the medical damages in these cases are millions of dollars. And then, believe it or not, but the government has studied what's the value of what you do around the house. And for some of us, we may do a little more, some may do a little less, depending on what our spouse says about us. But believe it or not, economists can value that. And a worker who can no longer work because of their silicosis, well, they also can't help her out in the house either, and we value that economically. Then there's non-economic damages. For a living person, their physical pain, their anguish. For a spouse, their loss of consortium. And then in a wrongful death case, loss of love, companionship, training, guidance, protection, affection, and so forth. So very significant economic and non-economic damages in these cases. And then also the jury is asked to decide, because I said before, these cases are about deciding who's at fault and how much. The very last question the jury is asked is, what's the percentage of fault of whichever defendants remain at trial? So, defenses. The defenses in these cases that the slab manufacturers and suppliers offer up, the number one main defense is it's the fault of a few bad actor, criminal, dry, slab wanderer, unsophisticated fabrication shop. And that defense is utter nonsense. The slab manufacturers and distributors know exactly who they are selling to. They know exactly which fabrication shops are fabricating their product, and they choose to sell to them anyway. They also know that there aren't really any so-called dry shops anymore. Even the most unsophisticated shops are still at least wet cutting. Another defense is that the 2016 OSHA PEL, which is the federal OSHA, is a safe level, and it absolutely is not. OSHA, in its own language, in the regulation, says this is not a safe level, and this is how many workers we still expect to get silicosis, lung cancer, other diseases, because the Cal OSHA PELs, permissible exposure levels, for anything, whether it's silica, asbestos, benzene, you name it, is never intended to be a safe level. It's a regulatory compromise. The scientists at NIOSH look at all the literature and they say, we think the level ought to be this, usually 0 or close to 0, and the industry says, hey, you're going to put us out of business. The end result is OSHA comes up with a compromise. Another defense, particularly in California, is that the 2023 Cal OSHA emergency standard sets forth safe methods. It doesn't. Those methods don't work. We know that from NIOSH. We know that from Australia. We know that's from hundreds of published peer-reviewed studies, that these methods like engineering controls, wet methods, ventilation, so forth, which were great for natural stone, work great for recycled glass, do not work for artificial stone. And so that's why we have this epidemic. Another defense we hear from Cambria, and ignore my lack of capitalization, ISFA and NSI, we hear that, our shops are safe and we don't have disease and everything's fine. As I showed you before, we're already looking at the data, and the data is showing that is not true. We're seeing silicosis in these so-called safe and sophisticated shops. Another defense is sophisticated or criminal intermediary, meaning the fabrication shops are sophisticated or they're criminals. We've already addressed the criminal part, and these same shops that they've claiming are so unsophisticated and not following the rules and don't know what they're doing and therefore it's their fault, they're also somehow sophisticated. So that defense doesn't work very well. Then another defense is sophisticated user. The worker themselves, they should have known that fabricating artificial stone was going to give them silicosis. As we've heard from the doctors today, vast majority of these workers are the opposite of sophisticated. They're typically migrants. They typically lack formal education. There's nothing sophisticated about them, even though they're amazing artists and artisans, and we'll hear from 3 of them today. The final defense is actually, we're hearing this for the first time in a case that starts trial next week in Colorado, is that it just must be the natural stone. Because before these guys, if they've been in the industry long enough, which many of them have, before they were fabricating artificial stone, they were fabricating natural stone, and it must be that it was the natural stone. Well, the problem with that, as I discussed with Dr. Cohen, is everyone has looked. Believe it or not, I've looked, the doctors have looked, industry's looked. We can't find a single published report of a countertop worker getting silicosis from natural stone before artificial stone was introduced. Was there some? I'm sure. But it was such a little amount that no doctor anywhere in the world thought it was worthy of being published. So the rates of natural stone causing silicosis was at almost 0, because we can't even find it, it was so low. And we heard about the unique toxicity of artificial stone and why it's different from natural stone. And so that's why that defense doesn't work. So these cases, they eventually get to trial. The first case went to trial in August 2024. That was the case of Reyes Gonzalez. Most of the defendants settled before trial, but there was a verdict against 2 of them, Caesarstone and Cambria, and that was a verdict for $52 million. Because when juries hear the evidence about what these entities knew, what they did, what they didn't do, when they hear the evidence about the damages, the end result is very significant verdicts. That verdict is now on appeal. The second case that went to trial was Garcia Roses. The first case, by the way, was in Los Angeles. The second case, Garcia Roses, is in Los Angeles as well. That went to trial in February 2025, and all of the defendants resolved for confidential amount during trial. Then we had a big coordination stay in California where everything was frozen for 7 months, 8 months, while the Judicial Council of California was working on essentially taking cases that were filed all over various counties and filed in before many hundreds of judges and consolidating them all down to one coordination judge. And that's now in front of Judge Burrell in Los Angeles. He has all California cases, so they got unstayed. And the next case that went to trial was Solano Castro in February 2026. Most defendants settled. There was some significant errors of law by the judge, so there was a defense verdict for the 3 remaining defendants, and that's on appeal. Next case went to trial was Gonzalez Quiros, also in Los Angeles in February 2026. That settled during trial for a confidential amount. Then in Los Angeles, Gonzalez Marin in March of 2026 settled during trial for a confidential amount. Jordan trial in Colorado starts on Monday with jury selection next week. That'll be a 2.5, 3 week trial. And then the Ramirez Soriano and the Martinez Paredes cases in Los Angeles are up for trial on May 5th. And after that, we have 26 more trials set from June through mid 2027, and then a whole lot more after that. Another shameless plug for my podcast. If you'd like to learn about this topic from also, hear me talk for a long time, please listen, like, share, subscribe. Hopefully I got us back on track. since I talk nice and fast, we'll talk later about regulation and potential regulations. But for now, before we go to our next speakers, does anybody have any questions about the trials or litigation? Oh, I covered everything just amazing.
Are you able to go by yourself?
Absolutely not. We have a huge team. We have 250 people that work on these cases in our firm, and the other firms don't quite have as many people, but more than one person that are working on these cases, because it takes a village. It takes a lot of investigatory work, a lot of paralegal work, a lot of attorney work. Depositions take a very long time, and these cases have to be worked up, and then have to get to what's called typically a summary judgment stage, get past that, then get to trial. So it is a very long process. Yes?
Is there any secondary exposure to family members or people who live in a community near one of these shops?
Great question. Short answer is yes. Have we tracked any sort of measurable incidents yet? No. We have sent a few family members for HRCT scans. Typically, like, it'll be a worker who has silicosis and they say, my child has asthma, I'm worried that I brought it home on my clothes. Thankfully, so far, no silicosis. Now, as we heard a little bit from the doctors already, and I think we'll hear more from Dr. Houlroyd, artificial stone seems to be causing a huge amount of asthma. So I can pretty much guarantee that is the cause of the asthma in those family members. Difficult to prove. And then of concern would be anybody that lives near a fabrication shop, because all that dust that's not going into the worker's lungs is going somewhere. And we saw that with asbestos, for example, a large number of neighborhood exposure cases, like people that live near transite cement, asbestos cement pipe factories. So I'm sure that's happening. We haven't yet tracked it. And then there's a third issue, which is all these slabs, after they're fabricated, they have to be installed. And when you're at someone's home, you're not using wet equipment. You might be wearing a mask. Probably won't be, because you don't want to scare the homeowner. Homeowner is definitely not wearing a mask. And while they tried to do as much fabrication in the shop, inevitably there is always rough cuts on the job site. There's always drilling holes for the plumbing if it's in a kitchen or bathroom. So now, is that relatively short experience enough to cause silicosis in a homeowner? Probably not. Is it enough to cause lung cancer? Probably yes. So that's a very long answer to your short question, that I think that those aspects are only just beginning. And as we know with asbestos, it took decades to see that really develop. So next, we are going to hear from Dr. Jenny Houlroyd, who is an amazing certified industrial hygienist and has a Ph.D. in public health. And we'll see if she agrees with me. I think that she has done air measuring in more United States countertop fabrication shops than anyone else in the country. So she comes to us with a great depth of knowledge on looking at this from this standpoint of industrial hygiene and how we consider those hierarchy of controls. So, thank you, Dr. Houlroyd.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. As a faculty member at Georgia Tech, we always have to give disclosures. All the images that I've collected and are sharing here are ones that I've collected while I've been out on job sites, or ones that we collected through a Susan Harwood training grant. And we were really lucky when we had that training grant. We were able to hire a professional film crew to help us capture some of these footage that we're using in all of these. And then also I have served as an expert witness, so full disclosure on that. Through my time when I did serve as an expert witness, I realized that lawyers need to know your credentials to believe anything you're saying. which is really hard to brag when you don't feel like you want to brag, but so I'm going to lay them out here so you know that I know what I'm talking about. I have a Bachelor's of Science in Environmental Health from Stockton University, and then I got my Master's of Science in Public Health in both Epidemiology and Environmental and Occupational Health from the Rollins School of Public Health at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. And as I was told when I interviewed there, it's the Harvard of the South. I hope you guys from up north appreciate that. Okay, and then I got my doctorate in public health policy from the University of Georgia. Okay. So, and I'm going to explain the story of this, but I've been a certified industrial hygienist since 2013, but I've been working as an industrial hygienist since 2005 with the Georgia Tech OSHA consultation program, which is a no-cost compliance assistance program that's funded through OSHA. And I'll explain that more when we get to it, but I've been going to stone shops for over 20 years. I'm also the course director of our silica class. But I want to give a shout out to my colleague Hillary Warren, who I've worked with for over 20 years. And when we were first starting working, she spearheaded and had a brainchild of creating this thing we called the silica matrix, where we really laid out what the exposures are in different construction jobs, and then what kind of PPE and controls you should have. And then she ended up going up to Washington, D.C. to testify, and parts of that were used to help develop Table 1 of the silica standard. So we've been working on this silica for a long time. I teach 2 academic classes, and I have a couple papers that are published, and I have more on the way. So why I'm here talking to you today, I've been an industrial hygienist doing visits for over 20 years, and I get emotional when I talk about this because more and more it feels like I'm working with the Walking Dead. I know that these men are very likely not going to get the treatment or diagnosis that they deserve. I work with small businesses and I empathize with the struggles of these small businesses. They did not know what they were getting themselves into. And I imagine that 1 out of every 5 workers I interact with is going to develop silicosis and die based off of the prevalence rates that are conservative. And we were going out to shops, and about 2017, we would go out to shops, we would say, hey, if you're doing anything wet, let's get some water on it. We could control the exposures and I could walk away feeling good about it. But around 2017, one of my colleagues had done a visit and the exposures were at 1,700 micrograms per cubic meter. And I was like, oh, what happened here? And the first rule of an industrial hygienist is if something goes wrong, you blame yourself. So I was like, did you flip the cyclone? Because if you flip the cyclone, the heavier dust could fall on the filter. And then did somebody mess with the sample and throw dust into the sample, like trying to figure out what was wrong? What kind of slabs were they working on? And most of the slabs in Georgia at the time, to my knowledge, have been Georgia granite. We're very proud of our Georgia granite. Just like up here, Vermont people are proud of the Vermont granite. So there's a lot of pride to that rock which you quarry. And I was like, there's no way the exposures were that high with our granite. So we went back out and resampled, and this was our first realization of this new product. So doing the math, if we look at like a 7 to 10 year latency period, we're at that latency period here in Georgia where I'm doing all my work. Next slide. Not too long ago, I went to the chem lab with a packet of Sweet and Low and a penny. And I said, I really want to be able to show people how much 50 micrograms per cubic meter. And so my colleague, Dr. Pamela Pillay, helped me measure 50 micrograms onto a penny. So you can see it is there. That's what it looks like. It's about his forehead amount of silica dust, if it were silica. You can make Sweet and Low look like silica dust. It's much safer when you're just trying to do a presentation. And then I was very lucky. My husband was good enough to build me a 1 meter by 1 meter by 1 meter cube out of wood that he had in the garage, and so that I could demonstrate what that would look like. So when we're talking about what can cause harm, we're not talking about a very large amount. Next slide, we've already talked about this a little bit, but what makes it uniquely toxic, we're talking about a mixture of chemicals. We're not just talking about silica, but we're talking about the resins, we're talking about the other minerals that are present, and a lot of it has to do with the way in which it's fabricated, the speed at which it's being fabricated, because the speed of the blade will really drive what's becoming aerosolized and how much of it's becoming aerosolized. We also are concerned about the size of the particles. The size of the particles is really critically important, and there's a lot of really great research coming out of the University of Adelaide in Australia that shows that the large mass of the particles that are generated are nano-sized particles. But not only that, they are shaped differently. So if you blow them up under a microscope, they don't just look like pieces of rock, they look like really craggy, I don't know what the best word to describe it, but that's the word I would use, where there's lots of indentations. And what that means is there's more surface area. And when there's more surface area, it can grab on into your lungs more easily and more readily. So when Dr. Shefali Gandhi talked about the macrophages, which are like the dumpsters of your body, they go in and try to clean up all the mess. They can't because it's really gripped and good. The other thing is they have this electrostatic charge. When an OSHA, before the silica standard, they had this thing called It's Not Just Dust. It was a campaign that they launched. And what the campaign intended to do was to really emphasize that when you freshly cut rock, there is an electrostatic charge to the dust that's produced. But when you have artificial stone, that charge remains for a much longer time. And that's what the research is showing. So we're talking about something that has a lot of factors that play into how it can cause harm. Next slide. It's also confusing. Mr. Nevin talked a little bit about this misunderstanding and failure to warn. I hate it when I go through safety data sheets, if a company even has safety data sheets, because it's kind of a weird concept for them that it's not a jug of a chemical, for them to know that they have to have a safety data sheet for something that just looks like rock. That is the first step. But then when I show them the safety data sheets, the first part here in this one example slide is that crystalline silica is about 90%. But what they also, and very often don't know, is that cristobalite is also silica. And so here you have a slab that has crystalline silica and cristobalite. So there's crystalline, cristobalite, and tridymite are the three main different types of crystalline silica, and quartz, cristobalite, and tridymite. And here you have one that's listed as a different type that people can't understand. So then I'm like, it's actually about 100% silica. Next slide. Can you click right here? Right there, perfect. So this is a short little video just showing how a shop is typically laid out. They're all different, but there's one thing in common with fabrication shops is they're all frenetic. And what I mean by is there's a lot going on, a lot of moving parts, and there's small margins of error and small margins of profit that they're dealing with. So everyone's trying to move really fast. Next slide. Okay, so Dr. Hoy shared the study that I published with my colleagues earlier when he talked about the respirators. So I'm going to dive into that a little bit more, but we pulled our data from 2017 to 2023 that we had done with shops where we had done sampling, and the sampling had been full shift. So that was one of our criteria. We had done sampling at more shops. We had done many more visits during that time frame, but we could only pick the ones that we could use for the analysis. They're all done in Georgia, and they represent sites during both natural and engineered stone. And Dr. Fazio and Dr. Gandhi both referenced this, that it's really hard to tease out what's going on, because I was at a shop last week. The first slab they processed was quartzite, the rest were all quartz. So sometimes they will have one natural and then a couple engineered stone. Some days you'll go out to a shop and it'll be all natural stone, but it is all has to do with the orders. We went to 11 companies and did 17 visits, so some of those visits were repeated. And we had 75 people that we counted for the full shift. 2 of them we had to exclude because they weren't full shift samples. Next slide. So this first one is for my mathematicians out there. When you look at occupational exposures, one thing that's really important to remember is that they never have a normal curve of distribution. So we never see a bell curve with occupational health. It is always this type of shape. And so when you do that to appropriately analyze the data, sometimes it's very often encouraged to use things like Bayesian decision analysis or Bayesian statistics. So I entered our data in a program that's called ExpoStats, and that lets us know what the range, that 95th percentile would be. And our 95th percentile would be 605 micrograms per cubic meter. So I know for the most part, you're going to be multiple times, at least 10 times the permissible exposure limit. Next slide. All right, so there's a couple key points I want to really hit home in. First, engineered stone for countertops do not consistently reduce exposures below the Pell, even when you're using wet methods. And the reason why this is the amount of silica is so high, and you really have to work on how you define wet. Because there's a little bit wet, there's a lot of wet, and if the wet water is not keeping the stone particles underneath what's being cut also wet, which is why we sometimes recommend having multiple sources of water, you have dry particles being thrown up underneath. So of the 63 employees who used exclusive wet methods in our study, 51% had exposures above the Pell, and 70% had exposures above the action level of 25. So this is really frustrating because employers think that they're doing the right thing by telling them to do it wet. And a lot of times they'll get that false sense of security, like you said, of not needing to wear a respirator because you're using wet methods, and the exposures are still sometimes up to 370 micrograms per cubic meter. Next slide. All right. Again, kind of speaking to the point that sophisticated shops somehow have this magical capability of removing all the exposures. For us, when we were looking at shops, we broke it down to less than 25 employees and more than 25 employees, because that is small and large when we look at stone countertop shops. Really, typically, OSHA defines a small shop as anything, a small business as anything under 250 employees, but that's not the way it would work for defining countertop shops. So when we broke it down between small and large, we worked with about 6 companies in the small, 5 in the large. We did 8 visits with the small, 9 with the large, so pretty balanced between the two. We monitored 28 employees with the small and 49 with the large. Makes sense. The large companies have more employees to monitor, so we're going to monitor more employees. But the exposure ranges, small companies, 9.2 to 370 micrograms, non-detect to 5,100 micrograms. So we are talking about astronomical exposures, 50% over the Pell here, 55% over the Pell here. Not much difference between large and small, 75% over the action level and 71% over the action level. So we're seeing that it's consistent, large or small. Next slide. Okay, I'm not going to speak too much about this. I just want to state that there's a lot of research that's being published that confirms this. That we are not out on a limb, and we are not speaking something that is completely revolutionary. And we are going back right now, and we are breaking the data up between morning samples and afternoon samples for the same data set to show just how variable the sampling is throughout the day. Because in the morning, if you're doing natural stone, in the afternoon you're doing quartz, you're going to have very different exposures. Next slide. And tell me if I talk too much, because I can talk too much. Okay, so I'm going to break it down for you. We like to look at things by what we call in industrial hygiene similar exposure groups, or SEGs. And basically it's a way for us to group workers based off of how much we think they're going to be exposed to something. The first group of SEG workers are the support workers. These are the workers that often get overlooked because what they're doing is they're showing up to the shop in the morning after everything dried overnight and the floors are coated with a thin coating of silica dust. They're hopping in their forklifts and they're driving around and kicking all the dust up. We monitored a select number of them and found that they are often over the permissible exposure limit, and they are not very likely to be wearing respiratory protection because they don't think they have to because they're not generating dust. All right, next slide. The next one are the automated tool operators, and these are the ones that in an ideal world, we would get most of the work being done with automated tools. I like to call them the set it and forget it's because if you do cooking, it's nice if you use a crock pot, you can set it and walk away. Well, that's the same thing with automated tools. The workers can punch in what needs to be done, they can start the work, and they can remove themselves from the exposure. The reality is, this will only ever get us so far. Because I know for a fact that the fanciest countertop purchasers demand the fine finishing work that can only be done by hand. And that's an important factor to remember, that even if we get most of the work done automated, if you're doing high-end countertops, there is going to be custom work at the end. And that's what makes these workers artisans. And that's what gives them the edge over competitors, but that's also what puts them at risk. So we still saw workers overexposed in the automated tool workers, even when they could walk away. Next slide. The next two groups are really the ones that are doing handwork. And I broke them up into two different categories. The first one, when the slide comes up, is going to be the small tool operators. For the most part, these tools now, when you go to Home Depot to purchase them, or Lowe's, I'm not selecting any particular box store, but I'm just saying any box store you go to buy them, those small hand tools come with a feature that you can connect them to do them wet. And when we get to the next slide, you'll see, because I took a picture last week when I was at the shop, where the hole was, because the last time I did a hearing, I actually was asked by the judge to describe where the water comes out of a saw, and I was like, well, I've never been asked that before, but I could show you. The thing with the small tool operators is they are using wet methods, but, and I have some videos to show you of this, it still produces a huge amount of water spray where they are going, it's going all over the place. But there's also situations where when they're doing the sinkholes or they're trying to work on an edge that's kind of hard to see, sometimes they will do them dry. And they'll turn the water off for just a period of minute. And that's why it's kind of a fallacy to say if it's all wet or all dry, because there are periods of time when the water will be turned off. I also know, and I've watched this, is when it's really cold out and their hands get cold, they'll turn the water off because their hands are cold. You're smiling, you probably know what that's like. Not calling you out, but I know that there's behavioral reasons why people won't wear it. This is a video of an automated tool. And what I want you to see here is, even though there's lots of water, you can see a fine mist. And in the next slide, you'll see the dust that's coming out when we do a screenshot of that. And the importance of this is there are nano-sized particles that have a different physics that can stay in the air for hours that are floating around these shops. Okay. So you can see here, can you see all that dust that's being presented? That's the silica present, still with the use of wet methods. Okay, cool, thanks. All right, also, you're producing a lot of water that is chock full of silica. It has to go somewhere. This is a picture of my hand and my clipboard. These are just water droplets that fell onto the clipboard. They're white as white can be. They are full of silica dust. We used to take tablets into these shops when we were, like, that's how we normally do visits. We have iPads and we take notes digitally. But now I've gone back to just using paper, scanning them as soon as I'm done and throwing them out, because after they dry, it's just coated in silica dust. And here you can see the water slurry down at the bottom. So these are the small tool operators. You can see where that has a single hole in the middle where the water would come out. There's the attachment for the hydraulics for the water to come through and for the tool to work. Next slide. And there's a video here. This is it being done dry. So this is a grinder. He's making a bevel on the edge. And you can see how much dust is being generated doing it dry. All right, and we'll go to the next one. And this is it being done wet. And so you can see, it's a little bit harder to see, but there is this whole spray. And then there's also dust when there's not enough water being generated. All right, and then when we go to the next slide, we take a close-up of his respirator. And this employee, having worked with wet methods all day long, what happens is the respirator itself gets clogged. And when you're wearing a tight-fitting respirator, it's a negative pressure, which means the more it gets clogged, the harder it is to breathe through. So if these workers are starting to develop asthma, what do you think they're going to do when it starts getting harder to breathe? I honestly have trouble breathing every time I give presentations on this, because I start thinking about what it would be like to not be able to breathe. I have that psychosomatic sort of response, but it gets harder to breathe through, and the first instinct when you're suffocating is to rip that mask off. Next slide. This is an image of a really highly sophisticated shop. They created a negative pressure where they were doing all the polishing underneath that one area where the air is being pulled up and out. And you can see in the morning when they first got there, all that silica dust had settled and dried. So you need to use wet methods and. So if you're going to control the exposure, wet methods and additional ventilation, consider negative pressure. Look at point source. Daily housekeeping is essential. Supervising and training, and ask why. You know, one of the big things that we are struggling with is the need to be wearing full face piece powered air purifying respirators. But what happens is they need to design them with windshield wipers, because when the water spray gets on those masks, the guys can't see. And it's important. They need to see the work that they're doing. Next slide. Then the final category is something that we always say happens in the way back. This is where you are laminating. And so the process of laminating is where you take two pieces of slab and you glue them together. Sometimes it's because you're making a big old fancy countertop. Sometimes it's because you're making edging around the countertop. So you have a thin slab, but you're making an edging around it to make it look like a thicker slab. There's a couple of things that happen here. You have to use a glue. These glues typically are asthmatogens. These glues will have that allergic response where you can become allergic to the chemical exposure. These glues also don't harden if they're wet. So if you're gluing two pieces of rock together and you notice that something's just not right and you want to do a little finishing work, for you to do it wet, you have to wait till that entire cure time has passed. So that slows you down, which is why a lot of this work is still done dry. And it's often done in a separate room behind the building in a shed so nobody can see it, is where we see it happen very often. But I'm going to show you some places where it's done in the company. So next slide. So this is a company that we went to 4 or 5 times. We went to them, they were doing it dry, we cited them, they were well over 1,000 micrograms per cubic meter. They implemented wet methods, and then they installed these water curtain ventilation systems. They're about $5,000 to $10,000 a piece, but they're not really designed for engineered stone dust. They break down. One of the stone shop worker companies that I talked to that does do a good job maintaining them says they break down after about 5 years. So we're talking, this is considered a ventilation system, but it's kind of like a consumable. And when we went back out on this particular day, that was just decorative at that point. It was not functioning, and their exposures were 5,000 micrograms per cubic meter. Next slide. This is what it looks like when you're doing it properly, and what the machine looks like. There's water pouring down, and then the air's pulling it through, and the water is supposed to capture the dust and pull it down. But again, this company said that it breaks down over time. Okay, we talk a lot about what gets on the ground, but dust settles on all different vertical surfaces. So we had a guy, we were all wearing respirators. This is not allowed by the OSHA standard, by the way. But I see companies do this all the time, is to use compressed air. And so this is showing how much dust settles on the vertical surfaces in a shop. And so even if they're doing a good job housekeeping on the floor, unless they're washing down everything from top to bottom, dust is going to be settling on every single vertical surface in these shops. All right. Next slide. All right, so this is my reimagining of the hierarchy of controls. Dr. Hoy shared what the official hierarchy of controls looks like, but my colleague Hillary Warren and I recently published a paper, and I have a link to it at the end, where we really wanted to emphasize that the hierarchy of controls, where we spend a lot of our time, is in PPE and inaction, which is really, Dr. David Michaels wrote a book called Doubt is Their Product, which is really about how industry sometimes likes to pin on we don't know enough yet to take action as a way to get out of doing something. And so when we want to look at the most effective, we know that there's alternatives. We know that there are ways that we can produce different slabs. So we can use action to save lives, or we can keep using doubt to avoid action. And we really want to look at where our values are and how we want to help protect workers now and in the future. And this is a big challenge because we're working with small businesses. I went to a shop last week. They had spent $1,500 on an air scrubber, which I didn't have the heart to tell them was doing absolutely nothing. It was a complete waste of money, and they were just throwing money at the problem, thinking they could solve it in that way. But because the air scrubber was not positioned in a way that was going to be close enough to the generation of exposure to pull it down. There's a lot of gray market versus established businesses. And what I mean by that is where we are, it's kind of like whack-a-mole. A lot of these companies will dissolve and then come open again under new names. So sometimes it's hard to keep track of the businesses. The cost of compliance, honestly, is a real big challenge. We had companies recently that had pretty high citations for stone countertop shops in Georgia, where they were cited approximately $100,000, but that doesn't even put a drop in the bucket of the cost of a lung transplant, or what it would cost to buy the machinery they need to do it in a much safer manner. So we're talking about a lot of companies rolling the dice and seeing that the cost of compliance is just so astronomical. It would easily cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to come into compliance with the standard with use of high silica content engineered stone. Language barriers, vulnerable workers. I had a worker last week that would not give me his full name. I sat in the office and listened to the front lady person in Spanish tell somebody over the phone that they weren't telling me their full names because of immigration. I don't care. I want to protect the workers, but I wasn't going to belabor the point or make them feel uncomfortable. But I know that the fear is there. We have a huge population of people speaking Portuguese and Spanish. So we've just gotten our handle on doing everything in Spanish. Now we're having to translate everything into Portuguese. So speaking to that needing to be in the language. There's also a disconnect between the suppliers and the reality of production. When you go into a big box store to purchase countertops, I bet none of you, if you didn't know about this problem, would think about the exposures looking the way they do. And that's what people don't see or understand. And then there's a lot of misinformation. I could speak for hours about all the things that I've been told when I've been interviewing workers and companies that they've been told that is wrong. Next slide. All right, so key points, and I hope I didn't go too long, is that wet methods don't effectively reduce the exposures consistently. All fabricators should address controlling silica using the hierarchy of controls, emphasizing the top tier of elimination or substitution. And I will not let a single one of my employees go out to these shops without a respirator on. And no one should be going into the shops without a respirator on. And I think that might be it. These are 3 of my publications. This one was the paper that Dr. Hoy brought up. This one is one I did with Dr. Fazio and Dr. Gandhi. And then this last one is really a essay on how industrial hygienists should manage uncertainty and the precautionary principle. So, thank you. Any questions? Do we have time for questions? Should we let Keith speak and then we do questions?
Anybody have one question? If not, we can. Okay.
Home Depot. They do a lot of this?
Okay, so they have the business, the way the business is set up is that the big box stores sell a lot of these slabs and then they hire third-party contractors to fabricate them. So it is any front store. So the way the market is set up is you have the manufacturers, you have the fabricators, and then you have the sellers. And then sometimes between the manufacturers and the fabricators, there's third-party vendors too. And so the fabricators, unfortunately, are stuck in between a machine and have very little capital to advocate for themselves on price points. So they're stuck between the manufacturers and the final sellers.
So what you're saying is there are not necessarily a lot of Home Depot employees that are doing this?
I don't know how many are actually full-time by Home Depot. I couldn't speak to that.
I have a question. If you have an idea how these small shops get rid of their, like the silica containing slurry?
Yeah, it goes down the drain or it goes into a water recycling plant.
Can I make a suggestion?
Yes.
I can't hear the question, so
Oh, I would be happy to repeat it. So her question was, what happens to all the slurry? It either goes out the windows, out the bay doors, or down the drain, or into a water recycling system.
And the bigger ones, they go to the landfill?
So eventually, silica is a naturally occurring mineral and is not required to be disposed of as a hazardous waste. So it can go into a normal landfill. Ideally, if we're going to look at it, that's what my third paper looks at, is the life cycle of a product and how we often don't think of the demolition that occurs when you're going to remove the product and then what happens after that with the material.
Thank you so much, Dr. Houlroyd.
Next, we're going to hear from Aki Vourakis. Aki, until recently, was the owner of a very large, sophisticated fabrication shop in Southern California called Aegean Stoneworks.
All right, good afternoon. My name is Aki Vourakis, and I'm an expert witness and consultant specializing in the respirable crystalline silica exposure arising from artificial stone fabrication and installation, what the industry calls engineered quartz. I spent 25 years running one of the largest and advanced stone fabrication companies in the United States. We employed hundreds of workers and completed more than 50,000 projects from residential, commercial, multifamily, builder, and big box retail. I did not study this industry from the outside. I operated inside it at scale for a quarter century. What I'm going to walk you through today is what I learned, what our own air monitoring confirmed, and what the industry has known and failed to act on for decades. Before I get into the substance, a word about scope. My opinions covered hazard identification, exposure potential, visibility of engineering controls, and industry customs and conduct. I do not offer medical causation opinions. My lane is the fabrication floor. What happens there, why it happens, and whether anyone could have or should have prevented it. The three numbers on the slide tell the story of my qualifications better than anything else. 25 years of direct operational experience, hundreds of employees, and over 50,000 projects completed. That is not academic. That is a product of building and running a real fabrication operation day in and day out. Aegean Stoneworks was recognized by Cosentino, the Home Depot, and Costco, three dominant entities in this supply chain. We received the largest commercial project of the year, Big Box Retail Excellence, the nation's fastest cycle time, and Costco's Fabricator of the Year. Why does this matter? Because when I tell you that even one of the best run, best capitalized, award-winning shop in the country cannot keep its workers safe, you should understand what that means for the thousands of smaller, less sophisticated operations across the country. This was our production floor at ASW. CNC automated bridge saws, routers, and inline edging wet system. This is not a basic operation. This is a serious industrial facility with every wet control the industry promotes. The question is not whether controls were in place. The question is whether they worked. Here's a core chemistry, engineered quartz, the material marketed under global brand names like Silestone, Caesarstone, Cambria, and dozens of others. Contains 90 to 95% crystalline silica by composition. Compare that to natural granite, 20 to 60%. Compare it to recycled glass, less than 1%. But the silica content alone does not capture the full hazard. In artificial stone, the silica is engineered, pulverized, compressed, and resin bound. That manufacturing process produces a dust particle that is finer and more than what you get from cutting natural stone. When you cut it, you are not releasing a rock's worth of dust. You are releasing an engineering hazard. This is what a slab looks like. It's a beautiful product and great to work with, but at 93% crystalline silica, one of the most hazardous materials a worker can cut without proper controls, which, as I will explain, do not reliably exist in the real world. Slabs are used to create kitchen, bathroom, barbecue countertops, shower walls, temp surrounds, and more, which are all custom parts. Every linear foot of this material that has cut, laminated, ground, or polished generates hazardous respirable dust. A standard kitchen countertop requires dozens of cuts, multiple grinding operations, and field installation. Each one of those tasks is an exposure event. They accumulate over a course of a shift, they accumulate over the course of a career. Now we get to the heart of the matter. At Aegean Stoneworks, we had everything: CNC automation, digital templating, water recycling, ventilation, full PPE programs, and air monitoring conducted in 2019 and 2022. The result? Respirable crystalline silica levels still exceeded OSHA's permissible exposure level limit of 50 micrograms per cubic meter of air during routine fabrication operations. This is the most important takeaway from my 25 years of experience. Even a well-capitalized, highly disciplined fabrication shop using the best available controls cannot reliably keep exposure below the legal limit. And here's the reason why. No matter how automated your shop is, certain fabrication steps cannot be automated, such as lamination of 2 centimeter slabs and field installation adjustments. Those tasks are done by hand. They have always been done by hand, and they are constantly generate the highest silica exposure in the entire work floor. I want to stop for a moment to give you a sense of what 50 micrograms per cubic meter actually means. Ms. Houlroyd actually covered this as well with the same figure of the penny with 50 micrograms of silica dust on it. 50 micrograms is 500 thousandths of a gram spread across a cubic meter of air over an 8-hour shift. It is approximately 1/500th the weight of a single grain of table salt. You cannot see it. And our formal air monitoring, done in a shop with best available wet controls, showed that we were exceeding that limit during routine operations. That is not negligence on our part. That is the nature of this material. Field installation is where some of the highest exposures occur and the least controls exist. When an installer makes a field cut with an angle grinder to adjust a piece that does not fit, they are cutting dry at a job site in an uncontrolled environment, utilizing only a small vacuum, often without a respirator. This is common practice. It is not the exception. It is a standard way field adjustments are made. Now let me explain why this epidemic happened. It did not happen because of ignorance. It happened because of structural decisions made by manufacturers and retailers that predictably place workers at risk. 3 drivers. First, product design. Manufacturers pushed 2 centimeter slabs to compete for market share. The consequence, foreseeable and foreseen, was that fabricators had to laminate those thinner slabs, which doubled the grinding in hand finishing work. More grinding equals more silica exposure. Second, distribution into unsophisticated shops. Manufacturers ran a dual distribution system, direct sales to large, sophisticated fabricators like mine, and broad indirect sales through distributors and retailers to small, unsophisticated shops and contractors who had no engineering controls at all. These are the dry shops. No wet suppression, no LEV. Manufacturers knew who was in that distribution chain. They knew those shops were dry cutting. They continued selling into that channel anyway. Third, big box retailer pressure. Home Depot, Lowe's, Costco. These retailers controlled pricing, turnaround times, and workflow. Their inspections focused on sales, speed, quality, and customer reviews. They did not require silica safety certifications until after 2024. The message sent to the fabricator was clear: move as much of the product fast. These images illustrate what I just described. Dry lamination grinding on the left, a dry shop in the middle, workers relying solely on respirators because there is no wet suppression or local exhaust ventilation. And on the far right, a Home Depot partner meeting at Aegean Stoneworks. No silica safety. Review. Production metrics and cycle times only. The hierarchy of controls establishes a clear priority order for managing occupational hazards. Elimination at the top. Remove the hazard from the workplace. Then substitution, engineering controls, administrative controls, and PPE at the bottom. Let me walk you through why each tier of the hierarchy is filled for this specific hazard. Engineering controls. Wet cutting and ventilation reduce visible dust. They do not reliably reduce airborne, respirable crystalline silica below the PEL. Water mist itself becomes airborne. Slurry dries on surfaces and re-aerosolizes when workers move through the shop. Ventilation systems cannot capture all airborne dust being generated at the source, which is the norm in any production environment. Our monitoring confirmed this with wet controls fully engaged. Administrative controls. Worker rotation and production pauses sound workable in theory. They are not feasible in practice. Fabrication and installation require many years of training to develop competency. Skilled labor is scarce. Production demand is continuous. PPE. Respirators are the control the industry leans on hardest. They are also the least reliable. They come off for comfort. They come off for hydration. They come off because a worker needs to communicate clearly on a loud shop floor. Fit degrades over time. Filters clog. OSHA itself classifies PPE as the last line of defense for a reason. It is not a substitute for source control. The timeline on this slide is damning. Artificial stone entered the US market in the late 1980s. Machinery use did not become more adopted until around 2005. OSHA silica regulations were not enforced until 2016. Manufacturers did not begin warning fabricators until 2020. Cal OSHA's emergency standard came in 2023. That represents decades of widespread market expansion and largely unmitigated exposure. During that period, what did manufacturers do? They marketed quartz as natural and safe. They emphasized water use for tool cooling and warranty protection only, not worker health. They posted fabrication videos without respirators. They did not provide SDS materials or any respirable crystalline silica warnings on their slabs. They created a false sense of safety. This is perhaps the most important slide in the presentation because it answers the argument that better controls would have prevented the harm. At Aegean Stoneworks, workers at every level of the operation developed silicosis. CNC operators, fabricators, laminators, managers, installers, shop supervisors. People who worked in air-monitored, wet-controlled, PPE-equipped, OSHA-compliant environments. One of those workers died from silicosis in 2025. These outcomes did not happen because of negligence. They happen because the hazard is inherent to artificial stone fabrication under real-world conditions. The controls available do not solve the problem. They reduce some visible dust while nano-sized respirable particles continue to remain airborne. This is one of our CNC operators. Full PPP operating a wet saw. Engineering controls engaged. Exactly what OSHA says you should do. Yet, we still exposed. Let me summarize the conclusions that follow from everything I have described. 1. Artificial stone fabrication predictably generates hazardous respirable crystalline silica. This is not an isolated event. It is expected result of cutting, laminating, grinding, polishing, and finishing a material that is 90 to 95% silica. 2. Existing engineers' controls cannot reliably reduce exposures below OSHA's limits. This is not an opinion. It is confirmed by our own air monitoring. 3. Manual work is unavoidable. Certain critical fabrication steps cannot be automated, and those steps generate the highest exposures. 4. PPP and administrative controls are inadequate as primary protections. The industry has treated the least effective controls as its primary defense. 5. Manufacturers, distributors, and suppliers knew or should have known these risks. The distribution chain was visible. This was foreseeable. 6. Fabricators cannot eliminate the hazard. The hazard is in the product itself, the only control at the top of the hierarchy. My ultimate opinion is this: it is not feasible under real-world fabrication and installation conditions to consistently fabricate or install artificial stone while reliably maintaining respirable crystalline silica exposure below OSHA's permissible exposure limit. Thank you.
What was approximately the first year where you were informed by any manufacturer or supplier that there was some sort of hazard associated with artificial stone that was different than traditional silica natural stone?
That was in between 2019 and 2020.
And after that, did you confirm that your methods that were used in the shop were the engineering controls, administrative controls, and PPE that are required by OSHA?
So we had all CNC equipment at the time. The entire shop.
Meaning it was already wet.
It was already wet. All what controls were in place at that point. And despite that, when monitoring and testing our air, we still failed in many departments. We even tested our office. Our office passed, fortunately, but everybody else that was on the floor was above the PEL. So when we tested in 2022, we purchased new equipment. We changed our operations in a sense of how we engineer the product, how we run the product through our production line, and retested and again failed. So at that point, there wasn't really much for us to do as far as any controls available on the market to add to our existing production line.
So despite using all the available engineering controls, approximately how many of your former workers have silicosis?
From what I'm aware of, 8.
Thank you.
Sorry, can you talk more about what that warning looked like from the suppliers?
So every warning is different depending on the manufacturer, even though they should all be the same. Because at the end of the day, they're still roughly 90 to 95% crystalline silica. But yet, the warnings are inconsistent, inadequate, contradictive. Even if you look at their SDS sheets, they'll say, do not cut dry, but if you do cut dry, use ventilation or use a HEPA vacuum. Which again, I find that very confusing for shop owners, because which one is it? Can you or can you not cut dry? And it goes on. If you look at everybody's SDS sheet, you won't find one that matches or is similar. Again, some of them will only say use ventilation. Some of them will say use wet suppression. Some of them say avoid breathing. Some of them say do not breathe. Again, at the end of the day, it's a safety data sheet, right? The title of that sheet is safety, yet it's hard to find what the safety guidelines are, again, in the safety data sheet.
Thank you.
So lamination is a particularly dusty process. Can you briefly explain to us why lamination is required in the first place?
So in California, we fabricate 2 cm slabs compared to 3 cm slabs to the rest of the country. Nevada has a little bit of 2 cm, so does Arizona. But California is almost 99% 2 cm. Now, manufacturers created a 2 cm product opposed to their 3 cm in California due to Asian competition. So as China was shipping 2 cm quartz slabs over to California, they were starting to lose market share with 3 cm. Fabricators were finding that 2 cm material was actually easier, better for them to work with in a sense of weight-wise. Yet though came the lamination, which lamination, as we discussed today, is fabricated dry. It produces the most dust in any task in the shop, because again, there's no machine to date that could automate lamination for you. It's a hand task. And while 3 cm is 99% of the country, besides California, in my mind, I find no reason of 2 cm even being offered, I guess, unless again, they're competing with other fabricators or exporters or manufacturers, etc., that are bringing in this product from overseas, from Asia.
And so implicit in that is that the 2 cm is cheaper than 3 cm, and so to compete with each other over market share, they're flooding the market with 2 cm in California?
2 cm is less expensive than 3 cm. It is. So it is a cheaper product.
So then you have to laminate it to make it give the appearance of a thicker slab.
Correct. You know, the manufacturers are foreseeing a lot of issues downstream. Number one, higher exposure. It's much more difficult to manufacture versus 3cm, while upstream, they're capturing more market share.
Thank you for coming. I was curious, those cases that you mentioned, were they picked up like through medical surveillance, or were the workers diagnosed like through the hospital, or?
So from what I'm aware of, all those employees of mine who have been diagnosed with silicosis had HRCT scans.
Okay, all right, thank you.
You're welcome.
I have another question. So part of the hierarchy of controls is administrative control, and that includes like worker training and education. So how often do you do that? And how good, you know, because sometimes like people come and go, and I don't know much about the company, but sometimes you do hire like contractors. So how good are you with that? I know it doesn't remove the hazard, but you know, like letting the workers know what they're in for.
So that was the issue with administrative controls. A lot of these fabricators are trained for their tasks. So installers are trained to be installers. Fabricators are trained to be fabricators. CNC operators are trained to be CNC operators. So rotating employees is very difficult, because if you want to train, let's call it the ultimate fabricator who knows how to operate CNC machinery, how to install, how to fabricate, how to laminate, how to engineer, that would take over 10 years to train an employee of that such. So yet we have high turnover, number one, in our industry. Number two, again, finding employees is scarce. So it's almost impossible to apply administrative controls as far as rotating workers. We were unable to capture administrative controls.
How about like the education part, like training, like how I know that, you know, it's hard with a high turnover, but like how do you like, because I know that with, you know, some workers or contractors, like those are the ones that are higher risk because maybe they're not, you know, trained well, or they're just there for like a certain amount of time, which also is good for them because their exposure is less.
I mean, contractors for sure have high exposure that are doing it themselves and not going through a fabricator, which a lot of contractors do. They'll go buy through third-party suppliers and they'll fabricate their own material. And they definitely do not have any engineering controls. So I can't really speak on their training, but as far as our training goes, again, we usually train for a specific position. We'll try to cross-train as best as possible, but again, it has to be feasible as far as the timing piece. Because again, if you try to train across every single department in the company, it would just take years and years and years.
Are you familiar with any community colleges or on-the-job training programs that do educate people about
So we
this
offer.
hazard?
So our training was all specifically on the job.
What about community colleges? Do they offer
Not that I'm
anything
aware of.
about this hazard?
Regarding silica or regarding how to fabricate and install?
About silica?
For silica, I would imagine so. That's not something that I've engaged in myself personally. But however, regarding our own worker safety, we conducted weekly meetings every Monday morning consistently regarding silica safety.
Brian, just to follow up on that last question, so for example, Caesarstone has Master of Stone, and Cambria has Cambria University, and so the manufacturers do offer, and NSI, a Natural Stone Institute, has a program, so they do offer free training, which does include an element of silica safety. The problem, as Dr. Houlroyd showed us earlier, is basically the training is do it wet. And Dr. Houlroyd and the other doctors today showed us how doing it wet doesn't help when it's artificial stone. Next, we're going to hear from 3 fabrication workers. First, starting with online, Mr. Jose Pena, with Charlie Velasco Ariza, who's going to translate for him. And if anybody speak Spanish. Charlie is the host of a Spanish version of the podcast that I plugged before.
José, buenas tardes. Lo estamos escuchando en este momento.
Muy buenas tardes a todos.
We're ready for you.
Everybody.
We're ready for you. So, Jose, can you tell us a little bit about your story?
Yes. Hola, mi nombre es José Andrade. Trabajé en la industria de fabricación de cubiertas durante 33 años en el área de la bahía de San Francisco. Antes de que me diagnosticaran silicosis avanzada por piedra artificial en el 2024. Durante ese tiempo estuve expuesto repetidamente al polvo que se genera al fabricar losas de piedra artificial con sílice cristalina para convertirlas en cubiertos. Aunque los talleres donde trabajé con piedra artificial siempre usaban sistema de corte con agua. La exposición al polvo aún así ocurría. Es imposible evitarlo. Cuando trabajaba con piedras artificiales, siempre usaba cubrebocas. Sin embargo, el polvo de la piedra artificial es mucho más fino que el de la piedra natural. Pero los fabricantes de las losas de piedra artificial nos decían que era lo mismo que la piedra natural. Nunca nos explicaron lo peligroso que realmente era.
Don José,
sí.
Voy a empezar a traducir, ¿ok?
Sí, está bien.
My name is Jose Andrade. I worked in the countertop fabrication industry for 33 years in the San Francisco Bay Area. In 2024, I was diagnosed with advanced artificial stone silicosis. During my career, I was repeatedly exposed to dust created while cutting and fabricating artificial stone slabs that contain crystalline silica. The shops where I worked always used water cutting systems, but dust exposure still happened. It is impossible to fully prevent it. When I worked with artificial stone, I always wore a mask. Even so, the dust from artificial stone is much finer than dust from natural stone. The slab manufacturers told us it was the same as natural stone and never explained how dangerous it really was. Siga, por favor.
Los fabricantes de las losas artificiales nunca nos advirtieron, nunca nos dieron capacitación en seguridad, nunca nos proporcionaron hojas de datos de seguridad, nunca nos dieron ningún material para informarnos de que la piedra artificial era tan peligrosa. Nos mintieron a mí y a mis empleadores y todavía hoy siguen mintiendo. Si los fabricantes de las losas nos hubieran educado y advertido adecuadamente, mis empleadores, mis compañeros de trabajo y yo habríamos tomado las precauciones necesarias.
Artificial stone, permítame, por favor. The artificial stone slab manufacturers never warned us. They never provided safety training, safety data sheets, or any materials explaining how dangerous artificial stone truly is. They lied to me and they lied to my employers. They continue to lie today. If we had been properly warned and educated by the manufacturers, my coworkers, my employers, and I would have taken stronger precautions. Por favor, sigamos.
Los fabricantes y proveedores de las losas son responsables de toda esta enfermedad y muerte, porque sabían que estaban vendiendo un producto tóxico y debieron haber sido honestos sobre los riesgos. La transparencia por parte de los fabricantes pudo haber salvado vidas.
The slab manufacturers and suppliers are responsible for this disease and the death it has caused. They knew they were selling a toxic product and failed to be honest about the risks. Transparency from the manufacturers could have saved lives. Diga, por favor.
Es doloroso y frustrante saber que nuestro gobierno todavía permite que estos productos artificiales tóxicos se sigan vendiendo. Debió haberse retirado del mercado hace mucho tiempo. Esto se pudo haber evitado. Los dueños de los talleres de fabricación y los trabajadores tenemos familias que alimentar. Vamos a fabricar lo que esté disponible en el mercado. Tenemos que hacerlo, o el taller de al lado se quedará con el trabajo. Me sorprende saber que ya existen productos alternativos seguros, como las losas de vidrio reciclado, pero aún así permiten que estos productos tóxicos y mortales se sigan vendiendo.
It is painful and frustrating to know that the government still allows this toxic product to be sold. Artificial stone should have been removed from the market long ago. This disease was preventable. Fabrication workers and shop owners have families to support. We fabricate what is available in the market. If we refuse, another shop will take the work. I am shocked to know that safer alternative products already exist, such as recycled glass slabs, yet the deadly products remain on the market.
En el 2023, por primera vez escuché de los fabricantes sobre los riesgos de cáncer de la piedra artificial, pero ni siquiera entonces hablaron específicamente de la silicosis. Ahora que me han diagnosticado silicosis fatal, entiendo lo que esta condición puede causar y trato de advertir a mis compañeros de trabajo. Les digo que protejan o que dejen el trabajo si pueden. Al mismo tiempo, entiendo lo difícil que es esto. La fabricación es un oficio altamente especializado y el ingreso mantiene a nuestras familias. Alejarse no es fácil cuando tu familia depende de ese ingreso.
In 2023, I finally heard from the manufacturers about cancer risks associated with artificial stone, but even then, they did not specifically warn about silicosis. Now that I have been diagnosed with a fatal disease, I understand what is the exposure and what it can do. I try to warn my coworkers. I tell them to protect themselves or leave the job if they can. At the same time, I understand how difficult that is. Fabrication is a skilled trade, and the income supports families. Walking away is not easy when your family depends on that paycheck.
Desde que me diera silicosis por piedra artificial, mi vida era muy diferente. Yo era la persona a la que le pedía a mi familia. Trabajaba duro, pues mantenía y me sentía orgulloso de ser fuerte. Podía cargar 70 libras sin pensarlo 2 veces. Trabajar todo el día y aún así llegar a casa con energía. Estaba orgulloso de lo que hacía y orgulloso de mantener a mi esposa y a mis hijos. Hoy, esa vida se siente muy lejana.
Before I got artificial stone silicosis, my life was very different. I was the person my family depended on. I worked hard, provided for them, and took pride in being strong. I could lift 60 pounds easily, work a full day, and still have the energy for my family. Today, that life feels very far away.
Ahora ya no puedo trabajar, no puedo hacer cosas que antes eran normales para mí, como llevar a mis hijos al parque, ir a reuniones familiares o pasar tiempo con mis amigos. Incluso las salidas pequeñas son difíciles. Actividades sencillas me provocan tos y falta de aire y me canso muy fácilmente. Tengo que planear toda mi vida alrededor de mi respiración. Mi energía es limitada y el cansancio es constante.
Now I can no longer walk. I cannot do normal activities like taking my kids to the park, attending family gatherings, or spending time with my friends. Even small old things are difficult. Simple activities cause coughing and shortness of breath. I get tired very easily and have to plan my entire life around my breathing. Fatigue is constant.
Esta enfermedad ha afectado seriamente la manera en que me veo a mí mismo. Me siento impotente y muchas veces siento que soy una carga. Mi identidad ha cambiado por completo. Pasé a ser, de ser un proveedor fuerte, a ser alguien que lucha todos los días contra el cansancio. Esta pérdida es difícil de aceptar y me afecta emocionalmente tanto como físicamente.
This illness has changed how I see myself. I often feel powerless and like a burden. I went from being a strong provider to someone who struggles every day. That loss is devastating and affects me emotionally as much as it does physically.
Lo que duele aún más es ver cómo esto ha afectado a mi familia, mi esposa y mis hijos. Están muy tristes al ver por lo que estoy pasando y están viviendo esta experiencia conmigo. Mi enfermedad también ha cambiado sus vidas y esto es algo que cargo todos los días.
What hurts most is seeing the impact on my family. My wife and children are heartbroken watching what I'm going through. They are living this illness with me, and their lives have changed too. That weight stays with me every day.
Mis doctores me han dicho que voy a necesitar un trasplante de pulmón. La idea de un trasplante me da miedo. En este momento, mi pronóstico depende de cómo responda mi cuerpo al tratamiento. No sé cuánto tiempo más van a durar mis pulmones Vivir con esta incertidumbre es aterrador.
My doctors have told me that I will need a lung transplant. The idea terrifies me. My future depends on how my body responds to treatment, and I don't know how long my lungs will last. Living with that uncertainty is frightening.
La mayoría de los días siento tristeza, frustración, miedo e impotencia. Me preocupa mi familia y también mis compañeros de trabajo que siguen en esta industria y que tal vez no saben lo que les espera. Comparto mi historia porque no quiero que nadie más pierda su salud, su sustento o su identidad como pasó conmigo. Alzo la voz con la esperanza de que otros sean protegidos y de que este daño no continúe. Les pido, por favor, prohíban las losas de piedra artificial con sílice cristalina, antes de que miles de trabajadores más en talleres de fabricación desarrollen una enfermedad mortal como la mía.
I live with sadness, frustration, fear, and powerlessness. I worry about my family and about the workers who are still being exposed to this product without fully understanding what lies ahead. I am sharing my story because I do not want anyone else to lose their health, their livelihood, or their identity as the way I have. I ask that crystalline silica artificial stone slabs be prohibited before thousands more workers suffer the same fate that I did. Don José, ¿hay algo más que le quiera decir al auditorio?
Pues sí, es algo muy triste y yo solamente quiero que hagan conciencia de todo esto que está pasando y que todo esto que están viendo en mí sirva como ejemplo para muchos en esta industria que están trabajando y que por favor pongan un poquito de atención más en esto. Gracias a todos ustedes por levantar la voz y que se siga escuchando y que se siga por todo lo alto que se escuche, porque esa es una situación por la que yo estoy pasando muy fea y yo no se la deseo a nadie.
He says that he wants to make aware everybody of the situation, that he's sharing his testimony because he doesn't want more people to go through what he's going through. And he is thankful to everybody listening and for raise the voice of the ones who are living through the situation in the industry as well.
Thank you, Jose, for sharing your story.
So much
next, we're going to hear from Jeff Rose and Wade Hanicker. Jeff is a fabricator from Kentucky who has silicosis, either one. And Wade is a fabricator from Florida. Excellent. Welcome, guys. Starting with either one of you that wants to go first, could you tell us a little bit about your story?
Sure. I'll do my best not to get overly emotional. I'm Jeff Rose from, my shop is located in Nicholasville, Kentucky. 23 years now in the business. For the first 17 years, I fabricated, operated a CNC machine, and install. I had gotten my son in the business as well. He actually spent some summers working with us when he was still in high school. I would bring him in to fabricate in the shop. So he is now a permanent employee as well with the company, and also has silicosis. So I guess it was in July of 24. I went to the doctor for, but I thought it was just an ongoing cough, and after a couple visits and they did some scans, saw some pretty large spots on my lungs. And at the first, they basically said that it was probably lung cancer. So, my wife and I immediately just went to the car on the way from leaving the hospital and called all the kids. Between her and I, we have nine kids. After a couple more doctor visits, they decided to do a biopsy, and that's when we got the results that it wasn't cancer, but it was silicosis. The doctor that we were seeing at that time, she said that because it was work-related, that she wasn't going to be able to see me as a patient any longer. I, at that point, had really never imagined that, you know, it would come to this, especially that my son, who's worked with us now for about 12 years, has beginning stages of silicosis also. After being in the business now for 23 years, I'm a 25% business owner, so I have to look at this from both sides of the scale here. While I want to keep our business profitable and up and running, I also have to look at the safety of all of our workers. We're going to do the best that we can to try to be a leader in the industry on making sure that things are done right and that the proper changes are made. I hope to get a training course going for our local community for working in our industry and also for silicosis as well. I don't know, the doctors, it seems like every time I go, it's something else. So it seems to be advancing very quickly. The spots in my lungs. They're pretty large. I don't have any slides to go wrong to show you, but they're very large. It's right now kind of not clear as to whether or not the actual silicosis is smaller than what it appears, and the rest is just my immune system kind of went into hyperactive drive, and which was Castleman's disease. So my body continually sends cells to my lungs to try to get rid of that garbage in there. But those cells are just staying clumped up in my lungs. Last visit, I went to the doctor. I see a doctor at the Cleveland Clinic in Cleveland. So I take a 5-hour drive once every few months, depending on when they schedule me. But last time I was there, she noticed that my windpipe, very much so like you saw on the slides earlier, my windpipe is just about closed up. They've prescribed me some medication that I use with a nebulizer a couple times a day, along with an inhaler a couple times a day. I'm trying very hard to not have a lung transplant. I kind of believe that that's would just be the beginning of the end. And, you know, I'm 56 years old now, so I would imagine by the time I needed a second set of lungs, I probably wouldn't not qualify. I don't take any, there's, from what I understand, I'm not a doctor, but there's 2 medications that is available for silicosis, but my doctor does not feel safe prescribing me either one of them. I stay up all hours of the night. I do just basically when I can't sleep, I just do a lot of reading online. At this point, you know, I'm very tempted to try some other things that that may or may not help. Hopefully, nothing that would do damage, but I've been reading a lot on peptides and stuff like that, so I'm going to talk to my doctor maybe and see if she would think that it might be okay for me to at least try something to stop the scar tissue from growing as best as I could anyway, because I do not want a lung transplant. I wish there was some way to turn things around or change things, but there's not. All I can do is keep the company that I'm part of now running as safely as possible and do everything that we can to make sure that, you know, the product is made differently. That's my number one goal, is to stop using the product that's not made right and buy the stuff that is made right. I've heard a lot today about a lot of stuff, masks and not masks, wet, dry. I honestly believe that it doesn't matter what you do, this product is going to get into your lungs and latch on and not let go. I just, it's horrible. You know, I have a lot of emotional stress. I get angry, I'm bent, I'm sad. It's just, there's so much going on in my family since this diagnosis that it's hard on my entire family. I have always been just the nicest person, calm. Everybody's told me that my whole entire life. I got that from my father. He's the same way. And now it's, you know, my wife tells me I'm snappy. My kids do the same thing. They say, what's wrong with you? And it's made such a huge change in the person that I am. I could never be the same. I worked hard my whole entire life. Since I was old enough to get a job, I've kept a job. I was born to work, and work is what I do. I don't ever anticipate retirement. I hope and pray that the business is successful enough and the industry cleans this situation up to where we can still manage to be profitable. And I just hope and pray for all the fabricators and all their family that they don't have to go through this.
Thanks, Jeff. Wade, can you remind us who you are and tell us your story?
I'm Wade Hanicker. I live in Tampa, Florida. I got into the granite industry around 2009, 2010, somewhere around there. Just started off as a part-time fabricator, helping out a friend. Within a couple weeks, turned into a full-time job. I was fabricating for 7 years or so. I'm always eager to learn to do new things. I learned as much as I could, as fast as I could. I think I learned faster than the average person starting in the industry. I was fabricating my own jobs within a week of there. And, it was a small shop. We had our bigger saw, which was a bridge saw. It's a manually operated saw, but it's wet. It has water that flows through it. But then everything else that we did was all by hand. It was more of an artwork. It wasn't to me, it wasn't work. It was art. We were creating stuff. We were a custom fabrication shop. So a lot of the work that we did was all by hand. Our sink cutouts were done by hand with angle grinders. So everything was very custom, and I liked that work, and I learned very quick, honed my skill, and I wanted to progress in the industry, and I knew there was more than just fabricating. And moved up to Kentucky, and we just found out today that I was working at the same shop that he was at, that he's now part of. And I started installing up there. I was there for 9 months, and I moved back down to Florida for personal reasons. And I was still installing with other companies, and I installed with one company for about 3-4 years, moved up to management, managed the whole entire shop, from fabrication to the installers to templating, and everything. That really didn't suit me very well. Then I went into templating, and from there I found a niche in the industry, and I started my own service repair company. I realized that no one was out there really doing that, just doing service work, the simple stuff that shops won't do for people that they didn't do work for. And I was doing that part-time because trying to get the business going, you got to build up your clientele, get your name out there, advertisement and stuff like that. And I was part-time with another granite shop I was doing service work with them and doing my own thing on the side. They were following me work on top of other shops that I would go around advertising myself, work that they would kick down. And I'll say I was doing that for about 8 months. Then I started feeling symptoms of the silicosis. And at first it really started off as pain in my lower shoulder blade, my right shoulder blade. And I just took it as like I had a knot there from always doing heavy lifting and stuff like that. And that was the thing, like coming through the industry, our concerns were hurting yourself through lifting, hurting yourself through the blades. When you're fabricating I've almost cut my thumb off before. I've had fabricating stones explode on my hands, slabs falling on you. Those are the hazards that we were concerned about. We were never really concerned about the dust. And go back to when I started feeling symptoms. I dealt with that for about a month. I was taking ibuprofen. I was taking about 2,400 milligrams of ibuprofen a day just to deal with the pain. Then it started creeping around my chest, and it was one day I was having a real hard time breathing. And I went home, told my wife about it, and she forced me to go to the ER. She was concerned that it was heart related. Went to one hospital, they did an x-ray, and they thought I had ammonia. Gave me antibiotics, ibuprofen, sent me home. I think they gave me like 18 days worth of antibiotics. I finished that, nothing changed. Went to a different hospital because at the first hospital they said they didn't have access to the CT scan when I went there, which I've been there before. I've had CT scans right away, so I wasn't comfortable with that. Went to a different one and they had CT scans and they found nodules in my upper right lung. Referred me to their specialist. Went to their specialist. Went through a couple appointments. They ordered a biopsy. Went through the biopsy, and they did determine it wasn't cancer, but at that time they were not able to determine it was silicosis. So they were very unsure. So they referred me to another pulmonologist at Tampa General at another hospital. And through about a year of going through their doctors, the disease progressed. Not only was I getting the chest pains, I accumulated autoimmune disease, anti-cysteine, which creates inflammation through your whole body. So from head to toe, my body hurts without medication. They put me on prednisone. At first it was very high dose prednisone. I was on that for about two and a half years. Now it's got to the point where the prednisone has deteriorated my bones in my hips, and I have avascular sclerosis in both my hips now, just from the prednisone. And about a year of seeing the doctors there, they did another biopsy, ordered another biopsy. Did the biopsy. I was supposed to go into the hospital just for one night, be out the next day. In that case, they went in through the side of my rib cage, multiple places. And in the process, my lung was stuck to my rib cage. And the doctor said for them to be able to do the biopsy, they had to unstick my lung from the rib cage. So they had to do that, and they think they nicked my lung in that process, but they didn't know about it. So coming out of surgery, have chest tubes in me. They're like, you should be out of the hospital within the next day or two. Day two goes by, I'm still in there. My lungs still collapsing. I still got a chest tube in. Week goes by, I'm still in there, lung still collapsing, still got a chest tube in. They can't figure out what's going on. Went through another bronchoscope biopsy. I'm probably not saying that right. And they found a little nick, and they were trying to get the lung to stick back to my rib cage to help make a seal. After 11 days of being in the hospital with the chest tube in, I have 2 little kids. My son was born in 21. My daughter was born in 23, and I got sick in 22. So the biopsy at this point was 23, and not to be there with my kids for 11 days was hard. So at that point, I told the doctors I need to go home. They put another chest tube in me and sent me home with the chest tube in me. I was still at home for a whole another month without work, but I was at least with my kids. The hard part about this is accepting everything that gets taken from you. I was what they would call a manly's man. I did everything by myself. There was nothing I couldn't do. I worked on cars. I did everything by myself. I could install whole kitchens by myself if they were manageable pieces. That gets taken from you. When I started breaking down the most is I went out to change the brakes on my truck, and I couldn't even do that. I couldn't even take the own tires off my truck to do that. Because I lost over half my strength. And that was the time that I had to accept that now I have to ask for help. I was the type of person I didn't ask for help. Never have. Then, and at that time my kids were still little, so like playing with them is not as at that time, they're babies. You don't have to pick them up, do much with them. Now, 4 and 3, they want me to go out and play Daddy Monster with them. They want me to go teach them how to ride bikes, and I can't. It's hard, but I know I'm blessed. As you've seen that there's other people with this disease that are a whole lot worse than I am. I am blessed that I don't have it as bad as them at this point in my life and at this stage of the age of my kid's life. My biggest fear is my kids having to hear the memories of me from somebody else and not be able to hear from me and not be able to make their own. So I'm blessed right now. And as hard it is to not be able to run with them and play with them, I make as much as I can. Make it as fun as I can with them and try to be the best dad I can, because I can't be the dad that I want to be. So it's hard. Then it goes on top of, what it does for your family. My wife, she's a stay-at-home mom, homeschools her kids, and now she has to pick up the things that I can't do. I live on a farm. I have 10 and a half acres that, you know, it's hard to attend to. So these are all extra things that she's had to help out with that she wouldn't have to, and I don't expect her to. But she does, so it's hard on her. You know, the mental aspect of everything. You know, it's hard. It's tough. But I just keep my faith and just keep on pushing through. I have to keep on working. I go to work every day, hurting on medication. Medication just barely gets me through. You know, that's it. Like, doctors tell me that they can make me live comfortable. That's it. And it doesn't get rid of the pain every day. The pain's still there. But I just try to be the best father and husband I can through everything. That's it.
Thank you, Wade. Question for both of you. Prior to being diagnosed with artificial stone silicosis, had any of the artificial slab manufacturers or suppliers ever warned you that their product could or would cause accelerated silicosis?
No.
No, we have never had a representative come to our shop and talk to us about anything like that.
And is that still true today? After your diagnosis, have the artificial stone slab manufacturers given you any sort of...
No one's came to my shop.
No, their sales reps comes to the shop, I would say at least once a month. I mean, you got Cambria, Constantino, you know, they come by, try to sell other things, but never once do they even mention anything about silicosis. I mean, we just had 2 of the head Cambria guys at our shop just the other month. Never once said anything about silicosis.
Does that cause you concern for other workers in your industry who, at this point, don't have silicosis?
I have overheard, I was upstairs in my office and I overheard one of the representatives come in and was talking with the girl downstairs in the showroom lobby about their changing the way they're making the product. So that, you know, reassures me that the people that we already have a business relationship with know that this is something that needs to be done. That makes me feel a whole lot better already. And then I just know that there's probably some others that wouldn't even consider it. And what's going to happen there is we'll probably end up parting ways with those suppliers.
And when you say changing the way they're making the product, you mean lowering the crystalline silica content from 95% to something less?
Yes.
And one of the things you guys heard today was that there is a silica-free alternative in recycled glass out there that everybody except Cambria makes. What do you think about the fact that they're still selling the high-content crystalline silica product?
It's going to happen. It's just a matter of time. I strongly feel that the entire industry is gonna set this right. I feel that the new glass product is probably the fastest answer or solution to that. What I'm afraid of really is that years down the road you may find out it could have similar problems or something. I just don't know. There's definitely some fear there with me on that.
Wade, what do you think about the fact that there's safe alternatives out there, but the deadly stuff is still being sold?
Yeah, it needs to change. I think Cambria needs to be held more accountable for that. They need to be making the change for that. Like I said, some of these other manufacturers, they've been pushing for the change, trying to make it safer, but you still have Cambria that refuses. And to me, I think that's more just about profit because they don't want to have to change the way that they manufacture stuff. They don't want to have to change chemicals, compounds, and stuff like that. which requires machining, remachining their whole manufacturer, and they don't want to have to pay for that. So they rather hurt us for over profit, and it's wrong. So they need to be held accountable. You know, there needs to be change in the industry.
Thanks, guys. For our last topic today, we're going to talk about regulatory efforts. And so first, let's talk about the OSHA 2016 PL. We heard a lot about it today. The additional points that I want to make is this is generic. It applies across all industries, and it does not establish any sort of safe level, but a regulatory compromise when it talks about a PEL or the action level. And importantly, outside of, for example, California and most states, this is still just the controlling law, is the 2016 OSHA standard, which does not require wet methods, contrary to popular belief. It essentially requires that you be below the PEL, but it's pretty much agnostic on how you get there. And then additionally, it did not consider artificial stone at the time because the literature that OSHA was looking when it came up with the 2016 standard, there wasn't any artificial stone literature out there for it to look at. So importantly, the level, while seemingly effective for natural stone, doesn't work for artificial stone. And when you realize that because it didn't even consider artificial stone, you start to understand why. You stay on that slide for a moment. So before we move on to the next, from any of you, any comments on 2016 OSHA?
I just want to comment that with any substance-specific standard, they're not meant to create it to be completely safe, ever. There is always an element of this is going to protect 1 in 1,000 workers, 1 in 10,000 workers. And so, I hear it.
Somebody's got their...
Okay. So we want to take into account the fact that... Okay, good. We want to take into account the fact that even whenever I look at any substance-specific standard, I never say that it's safe. I always say that you're either within compliance or not within compliance. But the levels that we're seeing of cases are well beyond what they expected to see with the silica standard. So we've already blown that out of the water. And I can attest the fact that when they were considering the standard, they did not include any data that considered artificial stone as part of that.
Now, Aki and Wade and Jeff, you were all in the industry going back to 2016. Did the slab manufacturers ever convey to you, hey, here's the OSHA standard, this is what you have to follow?
No, not at all. And on top of it, OSHA never paid us a visit as well in my 25 years of running a fabrication shop to inspect our air quality. I'm not sure about you guys, if you guys witnessed the same thing.
We have had a representative out just within the past 6 months.
And was that the first time?
Yes, first time.
I've never seen OSHA. As far as only government regulation company I've seen it come out is EPA. Make sure we're not polluting the air and the environment with a slurry. You're not even supposed to pump it out into the environment. You know, the stuff that the salts create, all that stuff, the sludge. You know, you have to dispose of it proper.
So, Dr. Houlroyd, when we hear slab manufacturers talk about, OSHA can just enforce the existing laws, how likely is it to get a visit from OSHA if you're...
So I would just say that OSHA is, in my professional opinion, a very small administration compared to any of the other agencies, and they only have a very small number of inspectors, and there is no possibility that with the number of inspectors they have, they could get to every stone shop. And to add to that challenge, there's a shortage of industrial hygienists when it comes to OSHA inspectors. So to be able to do air monitoring, you have to have specific training. And I'm not sure what the exact statistic is, but I think it's 1 in 20 or 1 in 25 OSHA inspectors is an IH. So the likelihood of there being the capability for OSHA to go to every single stone shop is virtually impossible with their current funding and structure.
We go to the next slide. So we're going to try to go in chronological order here. So we have the December 2023 Cal OSHA emergency standard, where this was the emergency response to the spiking numbers of silicosis cases in artificial stone fabrication workers in California. And it specifically targeted high exposure tasks, so cutting, polishing, grinding, cleanup. And it authorized immediate stop work if an inspector finds a dry operation, which we just heard the likelihood of inspection is very low, and mandates. So now, unlike the 2016 federal OSHA standard, Cal OSHA, as of December 2023, mandates wet methods and air monitoring. Dr. Houlroyd, any comments on the 2023 Cal OSHA standard?
So obviously this is a stepwise process. We saw what happened in Australia, that they also followed a stepwise process where they look at each option to see if it works. And so this was the first natural step towards seeing, could we control it? But there was papers published following this that this was not enough, and we can see from the cases that are rising that this would not possibly control all the exposures that are out there.
And is it correct that we also know from studies, for example, from NIOSH itself, that those mandated, the Cal OSHA wet mandated methods don't actually effectively work when it comes to artificial stone?
Yes, I had the honor of presenting to the standards board in December before they published the final standard after this had been in effect for about a year, showing our results that said that with wet methods we still saw exposures above the permissible exposure limit, and that alone is not going to solve the problem.
Guys, any comments on this?
Well, as I discussed earlier, wet suppression helps with visible dust, but it does not eliminate airborne exposure. And again, our shop was entirely wet, and if you looked at our air in the right light, you could see dust particles in our air, always. It's something that would just not go away, regardless of what we do. Even if we had a slower production day, dust particles would still remain in the air, then of course settle on everything from the floor and all horizontal surfaces, even vertical. And then housekeeping is another issue there, because you're supposed to hose everything down opposed to dry sweeping, but yet you can't sit there and hose down your equipment that's electronical or other pieces of equipment that are not supposed to be wet. So you have no choice but then to vacuum, again on the topic of housekeeping, which vacuuming kicks up dust. So in my eyes, I just think it's a vicious cycle, and no matter what you do, from cutting to housekeeping to maintenance, cleaning out your filters, it doesn't stop. It's a constant exposure. And again, as I mentioned earlier, I think the only way to make this safe is eliminating the high crystalline silica content in the material.
The other interesting issue touches on what you mentioned before, which is we have this California regulation that says you can't do dry work, but you have the slab manufacturers and suppliers selling 2 centimeter slab, which must be dry laminated. So they've set up this conundrum where it's impossible to perfectly comply with the statute, right?
Yeah, correct. And again, if you go look at their SDS sheets from the manufacturers, some do allow dry cutting as long as you're using ventilation, but ventilation doesn't capture all the dust at the source. Again, it's very confusing, very contradictive. Some of them will just say, their SDS sheets will just say refer back to OSHA's compliance. And they won't list any safety guidelines. So again, I just don't see that they're really putting the effort needed to keep workers safe.
Okay, if we go to the next slide. Okay, so in chronological order, the next is we had the Australia ban on artificial stone that Dr. Hoy talked about. It's the first national ban on, first starting out with the manufacture, supply, and processing as of July 2024, and then banned the importation into Australia January 1st, 2025, applying to any crystalline silica artificial stone that contains more than 1% crystalline silica. And that's to account for the fact that, for example, even a perfectly made recycled glass stone could have about 1% crystalline silica. That, of course, immediately shifted the Australian market to the silica-free alternatives, recycled glass and natural stone. Anybody have any comments on that, in relation to what we're seeing here in the U.S.?
From a public health professional standpoint, I think it's important to comment that Australia has universal health care. And so any healthcare services would need to be paid for and accounted for through governmental action. So there's a lot of, it encourages somebody to take ownership of that expense. And I look at the way our healthcare system is fractured, and you heard how complicated the diagnosis, and I am so sorry for how long it took you to get a proper diagnosis, where a occupational workup initially could have helped relieve you of so much pain and suffering. So I'm really sorry about that, but I think Australia had the benefit of the government needing an answer because it was on their dime. And so that's my one comment I'm going to make. Hopefully I don't get in trouble for saying that.
So when you hear the artificial stone slab manufacturers and suppliers say, well, natural stone contains crystalline silica, are you going to ban that too? Why do you pick on us? What's the response to that?
Well, I know that when I worked with companies and they were just fabricating natural stone, we could get them to use wet methods and bring the exposures down below the occupational exposure limits. And it was a process that worked. And this is not a scientific explanation, but artificial stone feels different. It lands on surfaces different. It smells different. Those are not scientific terms, I guess. Can you guys...
If you want to see the difference in it, take a teaspoon of dust from artificial stone and pour it on top of a glass of water and watch what it does compared to a granite dust. It's incredible, the difference.
It smells. No matter if you cut it wet or dry, it smells. You can smell it in the air. Some of it, from manufacturer, it changes, but you can smell the polymers being burnt in it. It just stinks.
So the science is working feverishly to try to prove that, but science takes a long time, and these guys don't have that time.
And numbers don't lie. The history shows that if there's more cases since we've started using artificial stone, obviously that's the culprit.
For the Australian ban, it's still very early, so there's not enough data yet, but the initial data suggests Australia is already starting to see a tapering of new diagnosis of silicosis. Obviously, there's going to be a lag, there's going to be a latency, but as fabrication workers, how does that make you feel to know that there's a solution that would be saving lives, but we're not doing it here?
It's kind of tough to kind of swallow that pill, it's to know that we can do better, but we're not. That's why we're all here, though, is to, push for that, to make it better. That's it. We have to, California's trying to make the push, and obviously a lot of things that California does the rest of the country kind of follows certain things. And hopefully they could compromise on something, you know, get lower silicosis, not completely ban quartz completely, but make it where they have to produce it below a certain percentage. You know, I mean, if not, we're just going to have this epidemic continue growing. In Florida, yes, I may be the first one, but the industry is dominated by Cubans or Puerto Ricans, and they don't want to go to the hospital. You know, even though that they're legally here, they don't want to go to the hospital to get checked. It's just how they are. I've talked to a lot of them. My whole shop is full of them. They don't want to go. So they might have it. You know, a lot of my friends in the industry, they don't want to go. One of my best friends, he's like, I don't want to go because I don't want to find out. And it sucks because he sees what I go through.
Next slide. So the next chronologically, we had California SB 20 that was signed on October 2025, again targeting the high exposure trigger tasks of cutting, polishing, grinding, cleanup. Again, requires wet methods and controls, mandates training and increased enforcement. Big problem. Zero funding was provided in the bill for any of that. So looks good on paper, but nothing actually changed. But Dr. Houlroyd, would this be, what did you describe it as a next step in what we try?
So from a policy perspective, the window is only open for this much of a change and an acceptance for this much of a change. And just to speak to the lack of funding as a state employee that works off of federal funding, we work super lean. We do as many visits as we can on as few dollars as we possibly can. But to do good industrial hygiene work, it takes a lot of time. And you can't do that without more people. And so without funding, you're not going to have more people. So you need actual human beings. Industrial hygiene needs somebody to put an air pump on a worker and explain the hazards. And you need to pay for the air sampling analysis. So that means there has to be a lab that will run the analysis, and that takes time and money.
Next slide. So next we have the WEMA petition to Cal OSHA, and basically WEMA says we tried the Cal OSHA emergency standard, we tried SB 20, and they didn't work, and the rates of disease are still going through the roof. And WEMA looked at what Australia did, and Australia, it wasn't a knee-jerk response. It was they studied a whole lot of literature, and they did a lot of what Dr. Houlroyd did, and studied a whole lot of fabrication shops, and came to the conclusion, which is what WEMA came to, which is the unique toxicity of the product because of the high content, because of the nano size, because of the metals, because of the resins, that it simply can't be fabricated safely by human beings. It's so uniquely toxic unless they're wearing a full moon suit. So WEMA petitioned the Cal OSHA Standards Board to issue a prohibition on the fabrication of crystalline silica artificial stone containing more than 1% silica. So essentially, like Australia's ban, but rather than a ban on the importation of slabs into Australia, this is a ban on fabrication. In other words, if it can't be fabricated, well then it shouldn't be supplied, and you hopefully stop the supply and manufacture of it. We go to the next slide. And so again, this is based on the toxicity of the stone, the limitations on protective measures, the problems that were discussed today with wet methods and masks, and focusing on the hierarchy of controls, right? That pyramid that Dr. Houlroyd and others talked about of, well, if masks don't work and you go up, and engineering controls don't work and you go up, and administrative controls don't work and you go up the chain, well, what's left is for the product manufacturers to substitute out or eliminate the hazard. And so that was WEMA's proposal. And does anybody have any comments on WEMA's proposal?
Well, WEMA cited my work, so I can say that I support, but the truth is, we are, the WEMA's proposal is really to look at the precautionary principle and say we should not be killing workers with a fully preventable disease in today's day and age. And there's no reason we should accept that. And so I am supportive of their rationale and their scientific evidence that they presented. They did not do this as a knee-jerk response. They could have done that back when the first cases were identified. They did not. They waited for the research to catch up and to show that there was not a feasible alternative. So I think that it's a well thought out proposal.
Next slide. So in response to WEMA's proposal, the ISFA, which is the International Service Fabrication Association, along with Cambria and Natural Stone Institute and some other slab industry lobbyists, essentially gave a counter proposal to Cal OSHA, which was don't prohibit the fabrication of crystalline silica. Instead, let us put in let us study for the next 3 years the possibility of putting in a certification and licensing program. And again, on the notion that the problem is the supposed bad actor, criminal, outlaw, unlicensed shops. And I guess I would ask the 3 fabricators in the room, 2 of you with silicosis and 1 of you with 8 workers with silicosis. Were you guys criminal, bad actor, uncertified, scofflaw shops?
No. I actually went through Cambria University. So, I'm certified fabricator and installer through Cambria.
And when did you do that?
Through my fabrication years, I would say in between 2010 and 2013, somewhere around there.
And when you went through Cambria University, did they teach you anything about their product causing accelerated silicosis?
No.
You unlicensed scofflaw outlaw shop, Jeff?
Absolutely not. Anybody's welcome to come visit anytime you want.
And how about you, Mr. Vourakis, when you were running your shop?
Well, many manufacturers have been to my shop, and even big box corporate executives, and they all said the same thing to me over and over and over, that my shop was one of the best shops that they've ever seen in the country, and that it was so clean that you could literally eat right off the floor. Yet,
that's a very big statement, and I'm very proud that you can say that. That's great.
Thank you. But yet, it didn't do anything, right? I still had 8 employees with silicosis. So it's just, at one point, it's like, well, what do? You have all your controls in place. You think you're doing everything properly and right, and you're compliant. This is why I asked Ms. Houlroyd at one point, what's the next step? Do you conduct in-mask testing? Where do you go from there, right? What is this? What is this certification going to actually do? How is it going to help fabricators stay safe? The controls aren't working. So unless there's new controls that are innovated to actually maintain the exposure below the PEL, it's just a piece of paper. That's all it is at the end of the day.
Well, in fact, our trial that starts next week in Colorado, the Caesar Stone sales rep testified in his deposition that their shop was the cleanest shop he'd ever been to. And yet, they all have silicosis. And the other point that I made earlier today is that the slab manufacturers and suppliers that ISFA represents and the Natural Stone Institute represents, they already know who they're selling to, right? They either have a contract directly with the fabrication shop, like your shop, or they sell to a third-party supplier that they know doesn't fabricate, so they know has to deliver the material or get the slabs to a fabrication shop. And there's only 2 ways that happens. Either the manufacturer or supplier provides a pickup slip to the supplier who's going to give it to the fabrication shop, who's going to then go to the manufacturer distribution center to pick up the slab, or the manufacturer or supplier distribution center is going to deliver it to the fabrication shop. Because how else do you get, how heavy is a slab?
Well, 2cm is a lot lighter than 3cm, but typically right around 700-800 pounds for 2cm, and 3cm you're probably
About 900 pounds.
yeah, almost kind of close to 1,000.
So that requires sophisticated trucks. And
Well, you're definitely not dropping it off at the front of the door, right? Like an Amazon package. So drivers of these manufacturers are witnessing the shops that they're delivering to. There's no question about that. They know the operation. They walk, every single driver from the vendor that we would purchase from would walk into our facility to find our receiving manager to let him know that he's there to unload. So they're very well aware of who they're delivering to. That's no question about that.
Is that the same with you guys, that
Absolutely.
they're delivering directly to your shops?
Oh, yeah. Like I mentioned, Cambria, we had two of the higher up people at Cambria in our shop just the other month. As a matter of fact, they were just dry grinding just a couple minutes before, and they're inside the shop with no mask. So is Cambria even notifying their own employees, training their own employees on how about silicosis, but yet they expect the fabricators to know that this is dangerous?
That reminds me of the photograph you have where they, was the rep, was it Cambria or Caesarstone that sent you the photograph, Aki, with from inside a very dusty shop?
Oh, that was Cosentino.
I got a picture of Cambria, of the two Cambria guys doing that in there.
So this notion that these unknown criminal shops just need to be certified and licensed doesn't fit with the reality of how these manufacturers and suppliers are actually getting their material to you guys and sending their sales reps to your shops and so forth, right?
No, they don't care. All they care about is how much they sell to you. As a matter of fact, say like Cambria, more you sell, cheaper they sell it to you.
Next slide. So this is a relatively new, just from February 2026 in California, a proposed bill from Assembly Member Philip Chen essentially adopts the ISFA proposal. So ISFA's proposal is to the Cal OSHA Standards Board, and now we have Assembly Member proposing a bill in California Congress that essentially copies the ISFA proposal, that adds this certification and licensing requirement, again, phased in, not even until 2028, supposedly with funding, but funding somehow from the certification and renewal fees, which there's no way that anybody is going to be paying enough certification and renewal fees to fund enough inspectors to go to all these shops. Would that be fair to say, Dr. Houlroyd?
I just want to reiterate what Dr. Hoy said earlier. They have a report that goes through the various policy steps that that entire continent took to address this issue, which included a licensing and certification phase, which they did not find was successful.
I suppose it's also worth mentioning that outside of California, the only law that's still in place is 2016 federal OSHA, right?
That is correct.
Next slide. So then here's the irony of all ironies. At the same time that we're going through all this, there is a proposed bill in Congress, federal Congress, HR 5437, that instead of banning crystal and silica artificial stone, like everybody who said here today, I think now understands is the only thing that's going to work to save lives, they're proposing to ban lawsuits, to ban the tort, both currently filed lawsuits and future lawsuits, to give immunity to the slab manufacturers, who ironically, the vast majority of the market is foreign slab manufacturers, slabs made in China, Vietnam, India, and many other countries, and then shipped in via the U.S. distribution companies, and then also Cambria. And so this is a bill that would propose to give immunity to Cambria and a whole bunch of foreign companies. Thoughts on that?
I'm not going to speak directly to that, but I am going to speak to the fact that there are protections for corporations that produce life-saving vaccinations from lawsuits. And when we look at that, we look at the benefit to society as a whole and why that protects them. And so the overall benefits of vaccination show that we can save hundreds of thousands of lives by having that. But for companies to be incentivized to actually produce those vaccines to save lives, they need some form of protection to be able to do that. I would also say that in other exposures, let's use hexavalent chromium for an example. Hexavalent chromium, I used to work in the airline industry before I worked for Georgia Tech. And hexavalent chromium is an essential element to be able to make the planes be able to withstand different temperatures, weather conditions, birds hitting the airplane, so we can all fly safely. There is a life-saving element to that being present. There's also a national security element to that. The same thing goes with vaccinations. I would ask the question, what societal benefit does it have? That would be comparable.
And it meaning crystalline silica artificial stone slabs, what is the benefit to society of those?
Correct.
And the answer is, well, it looks pretty.
I would ask everyone else to answer that, because I don't think my employer would want me to answer that directly.
Well, Wade, is it worth your life?
There's nothing beneficial about it to life at all. I mean, what, it looks good, so no.
And Jeff, you and your son have silicosis because of this.
I have seen some pretty awful looking quartz, artificial quartz countertop material, so it's not all beautiful.
Well, I think it's fitting since we are at the American Museum of Tort Law, and if anybody has walked around, hopefully everyone has walked around and looked at the displays, the entire purpose of this building is showing us how American tort law over more than a century has propelled us to safety, both for workers and consumers, right? It's why we have airbags, it's why we have seatbelts and everything else under the sun. So HR 5437 would be going exactly backwards. Thankfully, it's still stalled in committee, and hopefully it stays stalled in committee. Republican McClintock from Southern California. So.
I think it's a shame, honestly. I really feel that this is something that politics should be pulled out of. I mean, it's really unfortunate for so many people that politics get into the mix of things that I really, if we're talking about the safety of the people, it's a shame.
Okay, last slide, I think. And so, as we come towards the close of our conference, the regulatory conclusion is really, there's two options: eliminate the hazard, or attempt to manage risk, which we already know doesn't work for this product, based on Australia's experience and California's experience and so forth. Any final comments from any of you on that?
Okay, I'll lead the way. Quartz is a great product overall. It's also great to work with. Us fabricators, we find it less stressful to work with quartz than natural stone due to the fact that it's much stronger and won't break in your hands. So I'm not advocating for elimination of quartz. I'm just more so my opinion would lie on elimination of respirable crystalline silica, right? The silica content in the material. Again, if we could get silica down to less than 1% in quartz, it'd be a great product to keep around and have. But again, if we can't, I do not feel that high respirable crystalline silica products are a dire need, and also putting workers in a bad situation.
Dr. Houlroyd?
I would just say that I like to look at the full body of literature, and over the past 5 years, it is virtually impossible to keep up with the body of literature that scientists are working collaboratively to push out to get the message across of how hazardous this particular product is. When I started my career as an industrial hygienist, I never wanted to be in the spotlight or on a stage talking about stuff. I just wanted to help workers. My dad was a carpenter, my grandfather was a carpenter. I just wanted to make work sites safe. I didn't mean to step on this fire ant hill or whatever you want to call it, but we can't see how many workers are being sick, are getting sick, and turn our backs to them.
I kind of agree with them. Like
He's got
I don't want to see the quartz fully get banned, but at least lowering the silica content in it where it's harming the workers. They do have some really nice colors out there. I'm not gonna lie, but then they also have some really horrible colors. Like, what are you even doing here? But it needs to be managed more. It needs to be regulated more, just for the safety of the workers. We shouldn't have to risk our lives to make a living for them to make the bigger profit. At the end. I mean, that's essentially it. They're people on the lower end, the ones that are getting sick, they're not making the big bucks. It's the manufacturers, and they need to make a better product.
Yeah.
I think someone who both has the disease and running a business that's selling and fabricating this product, I have to, at this point, manage risk. Although I would like to eliminate it altogether, I am just one of 5 partners in the company. I have about a quarter of the input that goes in. A lot of our contractors, designers, decorators, homeowners that just walk in off the street, they want this product. While we are making attempts to change everything over to where we could buy a safer product, it is going to take a while. And that's just what we have to deal with for now.
Can I just add, you said something really important. The people who are asking for this have no idea what you're suffering through. I just really want to hone in on the fact that what's really frustrating about this and why it's not getting the attention it deserves is because it is men, largely a vulnerable worker population, that are getting sick and dying. And the woman at the counter selecting her countertop is not thinking about them. That's not in her calculus. The designers in a gorgeous suite, sea-level suite, that are making big decisions for a hotel are not thinking about this. And that's where the most education needs to happen, because that is the problem, is that you shouldn't have to make that decision. It should be on all of us to make the right decision.
Can I just say something? I know I'm not a speaker.
This is disturbing to me because I'm, just a customer, and walking into a shop was, I know nothing, but I needed new counters. And it's like, oh, these, you don't have to seal them every year. The bacteria doesn't go in, whatever, it's simple. Like, yeah, sure. Had I known this, I never would have even ordered it to put anybody at risk. And so information, I mean, if I had that information, my decision from spending my dollar, not that I could make a difference, but if everybody had the information and you could choose like, okay, for right now, and then, and I know you said it cuts easier or something, but maybe they can make a product that cuts easy. Because I understand you have to, but I don't want to contribute to hurting someone else unknowingly, so it's very upsetting to me. So I just wish this information was more, just like a lot of information, but I wish truth was available so people can make their decisions. I want it anyway, I don't care, but I would choose not to, and maybe a lot of people would choose not to, and then maybe the manufacturers go, oh, our sales are going down because they're not ordering it as much or something like that. I don't know, I'm sorry. I just am expressing how upsetting it is, and I'm sorry for all the people who suffer. And it's uninformed people who at the who are ordering it to make you suffer. So I don't know. I'm sorry about that, and I wish I'd known earlier, and I hope that this resolves, and hopefully with something like a product that works easy for cutting for you and employees who do this work, and that people are healthy. I mean, I guess change has to start from knowledge, but if the knowledge has been around for a while and change hasn't happened yet, it's time.
I think that's one place that needs the change, where we could try to make the change, is in the design industry, where the people that are doing the ordering of the product, like California, they set the trend of quartz, and now like I'm seeing more quartzite's starting to make a comeback. So it's the design industry that could make the change on what they sell, what they advertise. A lot of the customers, I like to call them HGTV customers, because what they see on TV is what they want. What they see in magazines is what they want. I've done several jobs that's been on TV and in magazines, and that's what customers want. They see that stuff.
Well, and today we're focused on trying to get the word out. I have a story to tell you to follow up with that, and that is, so last year I happened to be working from home that day, and one of the big box retailers' salesmen was in my kitchen talking to my wife, and I hear him saying, "These are all natural." And I walk into the room and I say, "Oh, did you pick the wrong house to come say that to?" And he had about 20 samples, and 19 of them were artificial stone. That he was there telling my consumer spouse that these are all natural. And so how is a consumer supposed to know that the product they're selecting is going to kill the worker if they're actively being lied to by the manufacturers and suppliers? So change starts, I guess, with each one of us, and we got to get the word out every day. Joan, did you have something to say?
Yeah. I just want to say two things. I have a cousin who's an architect, a big-time firm in New York, and another cousin who's a designer of interiors. Neither one of them, when I talked to them last summer about this, had any idea that there was any problem at all with this product. And they were selling it to all of their customers. And so I do think that another industry, if you would, that needs to be educated are the architects and the designers who sell to the consumer these products. And they were horrified. And I'm going to go see them this summer and see if I can get them to take some action. I don't know if that's possible, but I've been persuasive before. Maybe I can do it. The other thing I want to mention is about liability law and why the manufacturers want to pass legislation to get rid of it. And I've worked for 30 years, 40 years in Washington, trying to stop them from passing laws in Congress. Quite successfully when people get educated about why you need liability laws, because that's what makes them behave. Without those liability laws and the fear of being sued, manufacturers, businesses think differently when their tail is on the line. So that's one of the reasons for this museum, and trying to publicize the fact that it's really important to have liability laws to protect the public. It's really the public that gets protected. And thank you, everyone. You've done a great job. Great job. Thank you.
And thank you all. So if you're online, we will get back to you with the questions that we didn't get to. And I'm sorry that you can't drink our wine, but you can...
Available online.
Available online. There you go. 37 wine.
37 wine, and it's produced
by Mr. Brayton himself.
Shameless plug.
There you go. There's a shameless plug. Thanks, John. I wasn't going to say that part. And I do want to thank our other sponsors, Proceed and Passawix and File and Serve Express and Veritex for supporting this event. So I think we really, to sum up what we heard today, so much about today was about responsibility and ethics and law and what's required of all of us. Silicosis is, as we heard, the oldest occupational disease in the world. Silicosis is not new. What's new is this artificial stone epidemic, except even that is not new. This is established medical science for a few decades now, and yet the product is still being sold here anyway. So this is a disease, an epidemic that only exists because of this uniquely toxic product. So today we heard from doctors and industrial hygienists and fabricators and workers and litigators, all confirming one avoidable truth, that the problem is this uniquely toxic artificial stone crystalline silica material. And because of its high crystalline content, because of its nano size, because of its metals and resins that are unique and we don't see in natural stone. We don't even see, for example, in quartzite, which is natural and does have high content, it doesn't have those other problems. It's not nano-sized, it doesn't have the metals, it doesn't have the resins. And so, and we learned from Dr. Houlroyd and the other doctors who have collected data from all size shops, small, large, unsophisticated, sophisticated, and what they're finding is unmistakably clear, that when artificial stone slabs are being fabricated, too often it's over the PEL, and the PEL isn't a safe level anyway, and it's not protective of disease, and the wet methods are not working, and these workers are getting silicosis anyway. We also heard that, let's face it, they're actively still today being lied to by the manufacturers, sales reps, by their materials, by their training courses, and so forth. And so, you know, these aren't, I mean, the numbers that we saw, for example, from the CDPH, these are big numbers, but these aren't hypothetical. These are real people who've been given a real fatal disease. And despite CNC machines and air monitoring and ventilation and masks, we still have this straightforward reason that this uniquely toxic product, despite everything we can do, is still causing disease. And so no amount of discipline, training, certification, millions of dollars in safety equipment, none of that is going to be effective at preventing this disease. The only reasonable protection is to prohibit the fabrication of crystalline silica artificial stone. So, you know, we know that from the hierarchy of controls and the principles that this is not new. This is not something that somebody just came up with. This is established certified industrial hygiene from NIOSH, from really over probably 200 years of industrial hygiene, these methods of how to prevent disease in the workplace. And so that's why the legal record, the litigation record from torts is mirroring the science that we heard today. And that's why juries are making the conclusions that they're making, finding the manufacturers and suppliers liable, when you have a product that, when used as intended, can only be safely fabricated by a human being who breathes if they're wearing a level A hazmat suit. Right? It's just crazy. What are we doing here? And so, tort law is not about punishing industry, as Joan mentioned. It's about correction. It's about changing the direction. It's about realigning incentives when foreseeable harm is ignored, when warnings prove to be inadequate, and when the cost of injury is shifted onto the workers and their families. That's when we need tort law to right the scales. And so, perfect that we're here today at the American Museum of Tort Law. Other countries have already acted on this evidence. Australia has already done a ban. Italy, Spain, Israel, the United Kingdom, they're all talking about a ban. We'll see how good the lobbyists are there. If the lobbyists are as strong as they are at Cal OSHA, well, there might not be bans. They are aggressively lobbying Cal OSHA to not prohibit artificial stone and to instead study certification and licensing for a couple of years. And so if there's one unifying theme that we hear today, is that there really isn't any serious dispute. You're not hearing any occupational medicine doctor come in and say, oh, no, that's wrong. When all of the doctors and scientists who actually dedicated their life's work to studying this are saying, this is the problem, this is uniquely toxic, we all should stand up and listen. And so whether we're consumers or regulators or lawyers or family members or workers, it's time for everyone to come together to solve this problem. When the science and the exposure data and the human consequences all point in the same direction. So the American Museum of Tort Law exists to remind us that accountability is a public health tool. And jury trials, regulatory action, and scientific transparency are not barriers to progress. They're how progress is made. And they are how societies prevent the next Hawk's Nest disaster rather than just commemorating it with another plaque. So when history looks back on the artificial stone silicosis epidemic, the question will not be whether the evidence was available. The evidence is now overwhelming. The question will be whether we timely acted on it like Australia has already done, or are we as Americans okay with letting many thousands of fabrication workers die from a fatal disease that is entirely preventable. So thank you all for attending. Thank you to the doctors and the experts who shared their knowledge. Thank you to the fabrication workers who shared their stories. Takes the science and the data and ground it into reality, their lived experience. And so thank you to everyone here today who will carry with you what you learned today into clinics, into agencies, into courtrooms, into the big box stores, and hopefully make better decisions that benefit the lives of these workers. Thank you all for coming. Thank you where is she? Thank you to Melissa for hosting us at the American Museum of Tort Law. Thank you to Joan.